Okay, guys, we're going to get started. We've got a number of bills today, and we had planned on Senator Carter being number one, but since she's not here, we're going to go with Senator Rosapep, Senate Bill 269. Senator, you've got the time you need to present Senate Bill 269. We have one virtual witness that will bring in after you're done testifying. That's the only other testimony we have. So, Senator Rosapep, 269.
Thank you very, very much. Good to see you all again. This is a bill that deals with cryptocurrency, which has been a lot in the news. But this does not deal with whether investing in cryptocurrency is brilliant or stupid. This deals with closing some loopholes in our law to make sure that our intent in the General Assembly is carried through when we have new technologies like cryptocurrency. 4 or 5 years ago, the legislature created the Maryland Consumer Financial Protection Commission. I served on it along with Senator Benson and former Delegate Almond and former Delegate Bill Frick. It was chaired by a Marylander, Gary Gensler, who is now the chairman of the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission, who has been much in the news and out of the news trying to protect folks from problems with cryptocurrency. That report, I just want to read you one little line from it. We looked at cryptocurrency. We had hearings on cryptocurrency in that commission. And one conclusion was that cryptocurrencies have given bad actors new ways to conduct old crimes. And that's basically what this bill is about. It's to try to stop the new bad actors from committing old crimes. One section of it deals with campaign contributions. We bar cash campaign contributions over $100, and we do it for reasons of transparency and disclosure. Well, the point of cryptocurrency essentially is to be not traceable. That's the essence of the value proposition. And if you can't be traced, you can't enforce the law. So basically all this section of the bill does is it bars making campaign contributions in cryptocurrency or making campaign expenditures in cryptocurrency to make sure the same rules that apply to other forms of currency and other forms of financial assets apply to cryptocurrency. The second piece does the same thing with the tax laws. Under current tax law, the controller has the ability to go to financial institutions to get information relevant to whether people are paying their taxes. Cryptocurrency is currently not covered by that. Cryptocurrency companies are regulated by the state of Maryland, and we tightened up that regulation after the Financial Consumer Protection Commission made some recommendations along that line. So that's basically what it does. It closes a loophole on making sure the tax laws are being obeyed, make sure that the campaign finance laws are being obeyed. Happy to answer questions.
Okay, just one quick. I mean, I assume, have other states passed similar?
Yes, there are three states that have done it with campaign contributions. I don't have the number actually on the tax piece, but the controller's office is supportive of it, and we can get you that data.
Fair enough. Any questions of the bill sponsor on Senate Bill 269? Okay, seeing none. We do have, as I mentioned, one virtual witness from the League of Women Voters of Maryland, Jacqueline Coolidge is not, okay, she is not here. And Senator, that concludes the bill hearing on
Thank you very much.
269. Looking around, I do see Senator Reedy, so we can just take Senator Reedy next.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do.
And on Senate Bill 329.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have one person here I'd love to bring up with me, Miss Katie Berry from Carroll County Board of Elections.
Is she here in person?
She
okay.
is here in person.
In
the flesh.
virtual. Okay, so very good. Okay, Miss Berry, why don't you come up to the table with Senator Reedy?
Thank you,
Senator Reedy. Again, we're here on Senate Bill 329. So take your time and present the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, great to see you. Madam Vice Chair, great to see you all today. Senate Bill 329 will prohibit a person and make it clear in the law, in our state law, that a person is prohibited from willfully and knowingly casting a ballot in the general election in more than one state. It would put it in the part of the statute that would make it clear that that violation of that prohibition is guilty of a misdemeanor and subject to a fine of up to $5,000 and or imprisonment for up to 5 years. Again, willfully and knowingly voting in both states have to be proven. Requested by this has been requested by our Carroll County Board of Elections. Actually, it's legislation that was based on a case from a few years ago, 2018, where we had a Westminster man who had voted in both Maryland and West Virginia multiple times beginning in 2006. He was prosecuted in West Virginia, but we could not charge or prosecute him here. So this bill very simply trying to clear up an issue in state law, just to bring clarity, and it would add voting in 2 states in a general election, in the same general election, to the list of voting violations already enumerated in the election law article. So I would respectfully request a favorable report on this bill and would like to turn it over to Ms. Berry if I could, and then we'll be happy to take questions.
Okay, Ms. Berry, you've got 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Catherine Berry. I am here today representing my board members. I'm the election director in Carroll County. But as Senator Reedy mentioned, there was an issue several years ago that was brought to our attention. Someone that was convicted in West Virginia of voting in 2 elections. And it brought to light that Maryland does not have kind of the same laws as West Virginia when it comes to double voting. This bill has been brought to this committee a couple of years now, and we would just respectfully ask for your support on this bill this year. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for the sponsor or for Ms. Berry? Okay, seeing none, we do have one witness signed up unfavorable. So I'm going to call up Ralph Watkins. Mr. Watkins, you come up again, you're signed up unfavorable. And you've got 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. We understand that under existing, thank you, the League of Women, I'm speaking on behalf of the League of Women Voters. Thank you, Senator. We understand that this actually is already a crime under federal law and state law, and that was noted in the fiscal note as well. And we would encourage the committee to be aware of the procedures the boards of election already have in place through the Election Records Information Consortium, so that double voter registration is already detected before the person even attempts to vote. So that feels to us a more effective safeguard in this situation.
Any questions of Mr. Watkins, Vice Chair Kagan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Watkins, thank you for being with us and thank you for your advocacy for voting rights and democracy and all that. 2 questions for you. One is Senator Reedy mentioned that it couldn't be prosecuted in Maryland, but you just said that it could be based on federal and state law. Could you clarify that? And then second question is, how many other states, if any, have passed a law like this? It sounded like West Virginia has one, but if you could clarify, do you know whether there are others? Is this a common practice that we should be considering?
We've not looked into the what all of the other states are doing. The section of the Maryland Code we were relying on was 16201. You cannot vote more than once for a candidate for the same office or the same ballot question. If that is too narrow to have been prosecuted under the circumstances they talked about, it might be more effective to fine tune that provision. But I have to say, I'm not aware of what other states have in the way of double voting laws.
Okay, any additional questions for Mr. Watkins? Okay, seeing none, that concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 329. We do have Senator Carter in the House, and we're going to call Senator Carter up on Senate Bill 89. And Senator Carter, you've got the time you need to present the bill. We do have one live witness signed up in person. Are you Morgan Drayton?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Drayton, you can, you're going to have 2.5 minutes. The senator, as the sponsor, gets unlimited time. And then we do also have a couple of virtual witnesses we'll get in after we get through the 2 of you. So Senator Carter, it's all yours. Senate Bill 89.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. One of my virtual witnesses, Councilman Ryan Dorsey, actually deserves the credit for basically suggesting that we do something about this issue. In the last election, everybody is aware, or many people are aware, that there are numerous ballot questions, both state and city, on the for the voters referendum for the voters to make a selection. And from my personal experience, as well as just being at the polls and talking to voters, so many were very confused about what the intended or unintended consequences of bills, what were the details of the decisions that they made. We're well aware about the marijuana question being one of the major questions on there. That major question wasn't accompanied by legislation that we passed. And so people were voting in favor or not in favor of something with very little information about the details. And so this bill seeks to rectify that. I think it's such a wonderful public policy and such a wonderful assist for the voters. And so with that being said, I'm not going to belabor this because I want you to hear from my witnesses, but basically what the bill does is simply Senate Bill 89 requires ballot question language and affecting legislation to be published on the Board of Elections website at least 65 days prior to the election, improving access to and transparency of information. This will allow voters to be better informed by providing full details and the actual item that they are being asked to adopt by a ballot question. Ballot questions are a critical and fundamental piece of democracy. And when policy questions are so important, we put them to the test of the people. Despite their importance, voters often have the most confusion about the implications and effects, in part due to the lack of published information. So this bill simply seeks to rectify that. I'm happy to hear from the witnesses and take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll go to Ms. Drayton and then we'll open it up some questions. Then we'll go to the virtual witnesses. So Ms. Drayton, you've got 2.5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and members of the committee. My name is Morgan Drayton. I'm here on behalf of Common Cause Maryland to offer testimony in support of SB 89. We believe that the public can only benefit from increased access and transparency within our legislative process, especially when it comes to these highly technical ballot questions that will have a lasting effect on them and their communities. One friendly amendment that we brought up for the cross file and will also bring up here that we would urge the committee to consider is a plain language requirement, basically just to ensure that this information is being communicated in a way that's clear, concise, and understandable to the average member of the public. Otherwise, we are strongly in support of this bill and we would request a favorable report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. Any questions for either the sponsor or Ms. Drayton? Vice Chair Kagan.
Sorry. Thank you, Senator Carter. I'm curious about the level of sort of granularity. I don't know what word to use, specificity, details, whatever. So on cannabis, for instance, sort of yes or no, do you want it? And yes, the devil's in the details, but would it be, how much information would be anticipated to be shared and how much of that would be accessible? How, in terms of licenses and regs and purchases and taxation and ownership and impaired driving, and there's so many pieces. Would that all be?
It wouldn't be on the bill doesn't suggest that it would be in the box on the actual, in the voting booth where the voter checks yes or no.
Yeah.
But that it would be accessible on the website 65 days in advance of an election, so that those people that wanted to learn more and know more about what they were voting for would actually have access to it without trying to figure out, well, what bill was this from? Let me go to and we know how much people don't go to the MGA website to find a bill now.
Right.
Let me go find the bill and, just make it make it easier. I don't suggest that even putting it there is going to guarantee that people are going to read it, but I think it's good public policy to have it accessible to them if they want to read it.
So just one quick follow-up. So transparency and voter education, like great ideas. The question is who would draft it? Who would vet the information? The proponents, the opponents, a neutral party? How would that go?
Well, no, I think it's just the actual legislation as passed that would be available. So it wouldn't be opponent, opponent. It would be the plain language of the bill. And potentially, as Common Cause suggests, if we adopted their amendment, which I considered a friendly amendment, would be the plain language so that it's just made more clear to people what they are voting for without the technical legal terms that sometimes are there.
Okay, any additional questions? We've got Senator Augustine.
Yeah, so just in keeping with what the vice chair said, which I was following and I was tracking until the amendment, because now who is going to write it?
Well, that's a good point. So I said I consider a friendly amendment. I didn't say that's all worked out, but I don't know if they have a suggestion, but that wasn't the bill. But I actually think the idea of plain language is definitely of value so that people truly understand. I mean, we talked about this just last year or 2 years ago when we passed a law that said that when we advise children of their rights under law with police interrogations, we need to change the language so that children can understand those rights. So I think that rather than have just the technical terms of the language of a bill, it is a good idea to have plain language.
And I believe in the past that the state has worked with the University of Baltimore to work out plain language requirements for certain forms. So we're thinking that something like that could be worked out in this instance.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any additional questions for this particular panel? Okay, seeing none, we're going to go to the two virtual witnesses, starting with the aforementioned Councilman Ryan Dorsey. Councilman Dorsey, we do see you, and you've got 2.5 minutes. You're signed up favorable on this piece of legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. Thank you, Senator Carter, for bringing this bill forth and working with me on it. I'll give a little story here. On September 21st, during this most recent election, former mayor of Baltimore City, former dean of the Howard Law School, and current president of the University of Baltimore, Kurt Schmoke, went on to WYPR for a conversation about one particular ballot question that where he drew on air several erroneous conclusions about what the effect of this ballot question would be if passed by the voters. And by then, I personally already knew the answers to these questions that were being asked, and I knew that he was incorrect, specifically because I had asked the city law department if they had the underlying language that petitioners had submitted with their petitions for this ballot question. And they had that information because they got it from the Attorney General. And the Attorney General had that information because they got it from the Board of Elections, who the petitioners were already required to submit that language to with their petitions. And yet there is no requirement for the petitioners or the Board of Elections or any other entity to simply make that same information available to the public so that they don't make the same kind of erroneous conclusions that Kurt Schmoke made on air. It's so easy just to say that when you submit this information to the Board of Elections that they need to post it. And as Senator Carter said, when the city of Baltimore, when the city council and mayor passed a question for a charter amendment for the city, yeah, you can find that information if you can navigate the city's kind of cryptic site for navigating bill files. But I think it's easier if and more direct and accessible if the Board of Elections just makes that charter amendment language directly available, because it will have already been passed. It will already be available. We just want to make this more accessible to folks. And that is really at the heart of what this bill speaks to, is particularly governing documents where, I mean, a ballot question could be one paragraph that's 5 or 6 lines that hypothetically could be representative of a 300-page charter for the city. It could be a complete revision of the charter or the state constitution for that matter. The public deserves to have direct access to all of the details of what they're being asked to vote favorable or opposed on. So I appreciate your time and urge a favorable report on this.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Councilman Dorsey? Okay, seeing none, we're going to go to the final witness signed up virtual, favorable with amendment is Janet Millinson. Ms. Millinson, are you there? I'm going to queue you up. Okay, there you go. And Ms. Millinson, you signed up favorable with amendments. So you've got some amendments you want to describe, and you've got 2.5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, Senator Carter, and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Janet Millinson, and I represent the League of Women Voters of Maryland, a nonpartisan organization with 1,500 members statewide. One of the League's key principles is that election systems should increase voter participation. So we work to educate Marylanders on public policy issues, as well as the nuts and bolts of when and how to cast a ballot. You all may be among the many people who rely on our printed voters guide or our online Vote 411 site for this detailed information. State Board of Elections website is also a good resource for people who know where to look. However, as Senator Carter noted, all too often, Voters see ballot questions for the first time when they're faced with those little ovals reading for and against. At that point, they may not feel informed enough to choose. For example, in the recent general election, several of the statewide ballot questions got about 200,000 fewer total votes than were cast for the candidates for governor or senator. We support Senate Bill 89 because it requires that the text of ballot questions be posted ahead of a general election, quote, in a manner widely accessible to the public. However, like Common Cause, we'd like to propose a friendly amendment that the bill also require including a plain language explanation when a question's wording is necessarily complex. In summary, the League of Women Voters recommends adding such an amendment and urges a favorable report from the committee on Senate Bill 89. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Ms. Millinson? Okay, thank you. That concludes the bill hearing, Senator Carter, on Senate Bill 89, and we're going to next move
Thank you very
on
much.
to Senator Lamb, Senate Bill 366. And we have one witness signed up in person, but Ms. Smith, why don't you hold off because you're not part of his designated sponsor panel, and then we have one virtual witness after that. So Senator Lamb, you've got the time you need on Senate Bill 366.
Sure, thank you. And I think the one witness that was on the sponsor panel cannot attend, so it's just me on the sponsor panel right now. So thank you, Chair Feldman, members of the committee, happy to be here. For the record, Clarence Lamb, Senator District 12, to introduce Senate Bill 366 on Central Committee Legislature vacancy procedures. So for those of you who may have been on the committee before, you know that over the last few years, I've been working on legislation to create special elections to fill vacancies in the General Assembly. For the last 3 years, the Senate has unanimously passed this legislation, but the House committee has not brought the bill forward for a vote. Although I still believe that we need to figure out a way to include special elections in the vacancy process, I also believe that in the meantime, we should ensure that the current process is as transparent as possible. Additionally, any special election bill will likely include temporary appointments, and thus we should ensure that those appointments are as transparent as possible. I also want to note that this bill and my push for special elections are not related to any specific appointment, but rather efforts to ensure that our constituents can be confident in the transparency of filling General Assembly vacancies here in the state. As everyone knows, the General Assembly vacancies are filled via a two-step process. First, the Central Committee, locally representing the party and the district of the former member, makes a replacement recommendation to the governor, and then in the second step, the governor appoints the individual. This bill requires the Central Committees to use some, in my view, common sense transparency measures to ensure that the public can be confident in the process. Under the bill, Central Committees will be required to publicly post a solicitation for 7 days, publicly post applications for a vacancy, and publicly post or publicly interview each of the applicants, as well as hold a public vote. So the vote has to be held in public, as well as the fact that the vote needs to be signed so you can tell who voted for who. Finally, Central Committee members who are interested in filling the vacancy will have to recuse themselves from the vote. So if you are on the Central Committee, you would not be able to vote for yourself if you are an applicant for that position, candidate for that position. This will ensure that there is not a scenario where the deciding vote will be a member who themselves would like to seek the vacant seat. It's also my understanding that in current state statute, there are provisions that would allow state Central Committee bylaws to supersede state statute, which in this instance could prove problematic. So we are planning to offer an amendment to make those changes so that when it comes to state law would supersede Central Committee bylaws, so that in this instance, these provisions would be applicable. In closing, I hope that the state will someday embrace special elections for the General Assembly, vacancies, much like this body has passed repeatedly, unanimously over the last couple of years. But in the meantime, this bill that's before us now will help ensure that the current process is as transparent to the public as possible. Would appreciate your consideration for a favorable vote on this.
Okay, we've got a question from Senator Watson and then Senator Lewis Young for the sponsor.
Thank you, Senator Lamb. So I think all members of the General Assembly went through a very tough election to be back here. I don't know of any one of us who decided not to vote for themselves. Why should a Central Committee member be any different?
I think it's important when you have a small body like the Central Committee deciding an election, deciding who will serve in a seat for a publicly elected office, to be as transparent and open as possible when it comes to these decisions. And I think it violates that trust of the public when the deciding vote is the person that is seeking the seat themselves, right? There are instances where we have conflicts of interest and we recuse ourselves. In my view, if you are a candidate for a seat, really you should kind of, in order to ensure public confidence and trust in the process, recuse yourself, especially if you're the deciding vote that will put you into that seat. Obviously, there can be differences of opinion here, but I think, I think this is a common sense measure to ensure that level of trust and confidence that the public would have in our system.
And Senator Watson had a bill in another committee. It wasn't a
I thought he
reflection
just
of
didn't
your
like my answer,
response.
but,
He just didn't like what you had to say.
Just left him in his tracks there.
Correct. He was just overwhelmed with emotion by your response. Okay. Senator Lewis Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Lamb, for this bill. I'm curious as to why the bill doesn't identify the timing between the time the vacancy is announced and when the Central Committee has to post it. Because there's a lot of timing identification, for example, how long the application is open, how long the posting remains open, the 3 days advance notice of the meeting. But here's my concern. There's a vacancy. It's in the middle of session. And the Central Committee doesn't start the process. And so the district doesn't have representation. Should we consider recommending timing that the Central Committee post that opening?
Yeah, to start the process, I'm certainly open to, I understand what the concern here is that, after a vacancy is made known or public, the Central Committee could be slow in starting that process that would thus delay everything, all the provisions that were in the bill. Certainly open to looking at amendments that can start the clock when the position is clearly vacant, right? So when someone announces a resignation or the fact that they have left office, that starts the clock.
Okay, Senator Augustine.
So thank you, Senator Lamb. So just back on this Central Committee member not voting. These are the people who, I was one of them, who are a part of the Central Committee. Obviously that, it's not something we have a lot of trouble times filling the roles. It's kind of thankless sort of place for folks. Are you not at all concerned that this might, make it even harder for us to get folks who would perhaps be willing to participate in Central Committees if they would know that if they did do it, they may well not be able to be a part of the process?
I don't think so. And I was a member of a Central Committee as well. It's a thankless job, to those who may have been on Central Committees in the past. I think people get on Central Committees for a whole variety of different reasons, right? Folks want to support their party. They want to support their candidates. They want to, be part of that process in their community. I think my concern here is that it really reeks of a conflict of interest when an individual is supporting themselves. And I don't think it would necessarily dissuade someone from running for the Central Committee. I think there are larger and more urgent reasons that people run for the Central Committee than to think that, maybe in 4 years or 8 years or a few years down the line, this position is going to become vacant and I can be the deciding vote in voting for myself and pushing myself over the edge there. And I think the concern here is that for sake of public confidence and trust, that shouldn't be the deciding vote. The individual can, be an applicant for or be a candidate for that vacant position. They can also resign from the central committee, so that they're not the one casting that vote, or they can recuse themselves. This will ensure that public confidence remains. But I think, and we've heard, I think in the media, a lot of public concern about folks that, where it's a small group, maybe it's maybe it's a legislative district as part of a central committee where there are only 3 or 4 people casting the vote, and one of them is the candidate themselves that's seeking that office.
Any additional questions of the sponsor? Okay, seeing none, thank you, Senator Lamb. We're going to call up from Montgomery County, Lisa Smith, who signed up favorable. And Lisa, you've got 2.5 minutes.
Wow. He stole my thunder. For the record, my name is Lisa Smith. I'm here to represent the Montgomery County Women's Democrat Club. We recently created a new committee. We call it Advancing Democracy in Maryland. And we created this committee based on what we've seen, not only in the state and local government as well. I'm here to address the comments that the person made about being a member of the Montgomery County Central Committee. I am a member of Montgomery County Central Committee, District 14. I represent the great people of District 14, and I ran based on reform of the Central Committee. I ran against an incumbent and another person and won by 499 votes because that's what people want. They want reform. And like he said, it's common sense. It's simple common sense. I recently posted a petition online. I got almost 200 people to sign the petition to simply ask people, you can run for office, no problem, but just step down. It's that conflict of interest. And asking someone not to vote for themselves is not a big barrier. It just said, just don't vote for yourself. It just goes back to how I was raised. You got to do the right thing. And transparency allows you to do the right thing. Simply posting, okay, we have a vacancy. No, you got to do a little more than that. You have to inform everyone there's a vacancy. Speaking of which, we just made an appointment a few days ago, and we're going to be making another one. But not many people know that. It's our job to inform people, to make sure it's as transparent as possible, to build that trust in Montgomery County. It's our job, not to appoint us. For those people who decided to be a member based on being appointed, this is not the place to be. You're there to represent the Democratic Party, to raise money, to get voter involvement. And by having transparency, that's the only way that will happen. So I am asking for a favorable vote on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Smith. Any questions for our witness from Montgomery County? Okay, seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
We do have one witness signed up virtually, Jason Garber. Mr. Garber, we're going to get you on here. Okay, we see you, and you've got 2.5 minutes for your testimony, and you've signed up favorable.
Thank you. Yes. Hi, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and committee members. My name is Jason Garber. By way of brief background, I've served on the Central Committee in Baltimore County for the Democratic Party since 2015 or so. I've served at capacities such as nominations chair, parliamentarian, first vice chair, and for the last 9-10 months, I have been the chair. I'm appearing here today, however, in my individual capacity and not on behalf of the Central Committee. I alert you to the background so you understand the experiences I've had. Next, I'm not here to talk about the notice and public aspects other than note that where it says public notice in the bill, that may need some definition. Ms. Smith just brought up some issues as it regards to that as to what constitutes adequate public notice. Most of those provisions are already in our bylaws as it is. So I'm here to talk about section 4206 F2. In particularly, there's a lot of criticism about how the Central Committee conducts its appointment process and how it's done by a bunch of insiders. And I feel that that is an unwarranted criticism of the Central Committee, but nevertheless still hits a target that's accurate. 4206F2 addresses that criticism because it requires members who have a self-interest, or conflict of interest, as Senator Lamb has said, to recuse themselves. And that strikes a better balance versus resignation, which I've also heard some other people call for outside of this room. To address the point as to whether or not it's going to make it harder to serve in the Central Committee, the recusal option, I believe, will not make it more difficult to serve on the Central Committee. The resignation, on the other hand, would. So this is a very good approach to taking this. There is, Senator Lamb has already said, as has Ms. Smith, the transparency, the conflict of interest, and the self-dealing. All of those matters here. We have to foster the transparency, but also avoid the perception issues and the toxic cynicism that comes with somebody who is in control of a decision, voting for themselves or influencing a vote for themselves. So I want to thank Senator Lamb for this bill, and that'll be it for now. Thank you all for your time.
Any questions for Mr. Garber? Senator Hester.
I just had a quick question about the transparency of the votes. Do you think there would be any negative impact on the Central Committee members if they have to publish who they're voting for?
I think in this instance, you have to have accountability. You serve in this role for this purpose. If someone is uncomfortable with having their votes for who their representative should be within the district, they should not be on the Central Committee if they are uncomfortable rendering those decisions publicly.
Well, just to clarify on that point, so because I think in my own county, I mean, these aren't secret. Is it a county? Yeah, it's public. So it's all public currently. Yeah, but that's a state. We have a state law, so all the Central Committees have to. Okay, we used to have secret ballots, by the way, and there. Former delegate from Montgomery put in a bill that changed that. Just to clarify. Okay, any additional questions of our witness? Okay, seeing none, that concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 366. And we're going to next move to Senator Gallion, Senate Bill 287. And actually, I do see Morgan Drayton back here again. Why don't you come up? You're the only witness signed up, and you've signed up favorable. So why don't you join Senator Gallion at the table?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, fellow committee members. For the record, Senator Jason Gallion, representing Cecil and Harford counties, here to introduce Senate Bill 287, State Board of Elections, Municipal Elections, Publications of Results on Website. The Maryland State Board of Elections, or SBE, has a wonderful website that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. On the website, you can easily view primary and general election results going back to the 1980s. On there, you can find the election results of all federal races, state, and county races. However, on that website, you cannot find the election results of the majority of municipal elections. Very appropriate. We had all these mayors in town today. This is a very appropriate day to hear this bill. There are 157 municipalities in the state of Maryland, some large, some small, some urban, some rural. In any given year, there are dozens of elections taking place for council members, aldermen, mayors, and even a burgess. Unfortunately, it is not easy to find past municipal election results. For the most part, an individual has to search a local newspaper's online archives to find past municipal election results. But this is getting more and more difficult as local newspapers shut down, get bought out, or put up paywalls. Some municipalities put up their election results on their website, but those typically go down by the time the next election comes around. There needs to be a central online database or a hub for the voters of Maryland to find past municipal election results. Delegate Tomlinson of the Crossfile has worked hand in hand with both MML and the State Board of Elections to fine tune this bill and find a solution that all parties can be happy with. There will be 2 forthcoming amendments. Both came as a result of working with MML and the State Board of Elections. This bill will do the following. require that within 30 days after the election results are certified, a municipality must email over an electronic copy of the election results to the state board. These results will need to include the following: the name of the candidates, the party affiliations of each candidate, only applicable if the municipality holds partisan elections. And there's only 3 that do that. How many votes each candidate received in the following categories: early voting, if applicable, mail-ins, if applicable, provisional, election day, and total. The percentage of the vote that each candidate received, and the results of any municipal ballot questions. This will apply to both municipal primaries and general elections. To my knowledge, there are 5 municipalities that hold both primary and general elections. And instead of requiring the SBE to create an online portal for the municipalities to upload the results, as stated in the current draft of the bill before amendments and in the fiscal and policy note, the State Board of Elections has requested that the results just be emailed over to them, and they will publish the results on their website, where they will be organized by election year and then the name of the municipality. As a result, this bill will not increase general fund expenditures at all. All voters, community members, elected officials, and potential candidates should be able to view the past election results for any municipality, and this bill would make that possible. I respectfully ask the committee to bring out a favorable report on Senate Bill 287. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Why don't we go to our lone witness, Ms. Drayton? You've got 2.5 minutes.
Good afternoon again, committee. For the record, my name is Morgan Drayton, here on behalf of Common Cause Maryland to provide testimony in support of SB 287. We believe that voters should be able to easily access election results and data in one place for every level of government without having to scour the internet to piece together information from multiple sources. And with the rise of election denials and security threats to our elections, it's especially critical that they have that prompt access to clear, factual, and consistent election data from a trusted source. And given that SBE already collects and publishes similar data from each local board of elections, this legislation proposes a common sense measure that could easily be adopted by the board. We believe that this collecting and publishing of municipal election data falls well within the capabilities of the board's existing infrastructure, making this, in our opinion, an easy fix that would significantly benefit the public. So we would request a favorable report. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for either the sponsor or our lone witness? We've got Senator Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I like this idea. There's a couple questions that I do have. The first one is, how do you validate the result? I've got a lot of small municipalities and literally maybe 80 people or something like that. They may be still using an AOL account or whatever. How do you know, how would we know that it's actually the result and it's not necessarily somebody else? You know what I mean? How do we validate that?
I would have to check with the Board of Election. I'm assuming that the results will be emailed directly from a whatever the size of the town, official email account from that town. So I couldn't answer that.
They don't have them. So
Yeah.
I've got towns that don't have official emails or anything like that. They're small, right?
Right.
So that's one question. And I'm happy to get answers on how we can do it too. I really am. Then also there's also the situation where they just might not send them. What happens when they don't send the result? Because they just, they don't send the results. What happens then?
We'd have to research
So
that.
I'm putting it out there, these are questions that I would have, Senator, I understand, but I'd like to better know how we would handle those situations, just given my experience with my municipalities, who are really some small ones that, those are just questions that I would have. So thank you.
Those are good questions. Vice Chair Kagan, and then we'll go to Senator Carozza.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Senator Gallion, Straighten. I had 2 questions. Senator, you mentioned that you have an amendment or a couple of amendments, but I I didn't hear you explain them. And then the second question is MML's recommended or requested amendment was rather than saying 30 days after the election, which is what the bill currently says, it's 30 days after the election results are certified, which could be 2 months or something, or 6 weeks. It would be longer. And are you okay with that?
Yes.
So in either order.
I'd be, the second question first. That's fine. It gives them more time. Some, like we mentioned, some of these are smaller municipalities. It gives more time to get the information in. And to your first question, the request from the board was to just have them email the things over instead of going through an online portal. So that's what that amendment would address.
Me that Senator Augustine's question, maybe there could almost be a disclaimer of, we believe these to be the accurate results from the town of, 12 people. But sort of don't blame us, don't sue us if that's not accurate and we've been spammed or scammed or they're inaccurate.
And of course, we'd love to have results from all over the state. And, but, say if you have 130 out of the 157, that's a huge improvement, where you can have kind of one-stop shopping. If you're interested in looking at these results from these local areas, you can go to one place and find it. That's the whole intent of the legislation.
Okay, Senator Carrozza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Senator Gallion. I do want to thank you for this bill. As someone who represents 11 municipalities, I've actually gone on and tried to do this research myself. So, and I do think that given Senator Augustine's questions, maybe working with the Maryland Municipal League, that we could work through this. And again, I think the fact that you highlighted all the other results except the municipalities. And then when you actually have tried to spend some time doing this, I think, it would be a real service. So I hope maybe you with the Maryland Municipal League could work that out.
Right now, along with the House cross file, working, he's actually been taking the lead on that, working hand in hand with MML and with the state board. And when he came and requested me to ask me if I'd be interested in cross filing, that was the first question I asked. Is MML good with this? Because obviously they're the most affected. So I was assured they would be, and going to keep working through this together to reach consensus and have a good product for everybody.
Okay, well, we put some good issues on the table for the parties to address, including MML. Any other questions of the witnesses, the sponsor and our lone witness? Seeing none. That concludes bill hearing on Senate Bill 287. And now we're going to begin a series of bills from our vice chair, a total of 6. And we're going to start with Senate Bill 379. We don't have a specified sponsor panel, so we'll just have you, Vice Chair Kagan, present the bill, and then we'll bring up witnesses after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, colleagues. For the record, Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville. As the chair said, I have 6 bills. My goal is to run through them pretty quickly. I have been working on all of these issues for a long time and some for years, as I think you know. But I also want to keep today as brief as possible. We didn't recruit 1 million witnesses. I want to be very specific in my explanations and then happy to take any questions. Some of these are intuitive and some of them are a little complicated, but I think they are all bipartisan or nonpartisan, and I hope you will agree with that. So with that, so the first one, senators who are not freshmen will remember a reintroduction of a bill about canvassing. This was the bill that the General Assembly passed last year, sent to the governor, and on the afternoon of the final day that he could do so, Governor Hogan vetoed this bill. It was quite unexpected. He had not expressed any concerns. His people hadn't expressed any concerns during our whole process of debating and crafting the legislation. You may remember that the primaries last year became pretty big, of a hot mess, pretty much a hot mess as a result because of the delays, and the delays are in canvassing. So canvassing is how you deal with the mail-in ballots, specifically mail-in ballots, when they get returned. Now, when mail-in ballots were 4 or 5% of the ballots. They were not determinative of an election outcome generally. And so they could be handled after Election Day. Maryland is unique in the country in that our law says that they can't be touched. They can't be processed. They can't be opened. The envelopes can't be opened until Wednesday after Election Day. And the regulations are Thursday after Election Day. There's no other state in the country that has that. So the problem is that as our number of mail-in ballots has skyrocketed, the delay has meant that people won't know the election results, because when we're talking about 25, 30 or higher, in Montgomery County, we had roughly half of our ballots come in through the mail. And we expect those numbers to continue to rise. People like the convenience, the safety, the lack of hassle. They can vote as a family from their own kitchen table. And especially now that we've paid for postage and they get it early, we expect that that's going to continue to rise. So last year's bill did 3 things. I'm going to recap last year's bill, and then I will tell you this version is essentially the same, but it is not identical. So I want to flag the differences. So curing is when somebody sends back their ballot in an envelope, either through the mail, postage paid, or dropped off at a drop-off box or at their Board of Elections. And you have to sign an oath that's on the envelope that says, this is me, it's my ballot, I cast the ballot. If you forget to do that, your ballot will not be counted. So curing requires that the Board of Elections reach out to you and say, hey, you forgot to sign, and it offers options so that you can fix your ballot, not who you voted for, but just sign the ballot envelope, and then that can be returned and counted. Second, this bill, last year's bill, allows for the canvassing, and it was 8 business days before the start of early voting. That means that our boards of elections can start hiring the bipartisan teams. They can start processing the boxes and boxes and batches of mail-in ballots, start working their way through. And literally that means checking that there's a signature, slitting them open, putting them in piles, flattening them, running them through the scanner, but not pushing tabulate. It specifically says you may not tabulate. We don't want anyone knowing the outcome. Senator so-and-so is going to lose unless she hurries up and gets more of her people to come out and vote or something. We don't want any temptations, any threats, any leaks in the press. We don't want bribery allegations. There's just no reason. It's just not a good idea. So no tabulation. Nothing could be tabulated until after the polls close on Election Day. And the last thing, the legislature was really clear. We wanted election results by precinct. That's the way we always used to have it. We continue to get that. And so that's in the bill. There are 3 differences. One is that there has been a problem, not everywhere, not all the time, but there have been some significant delays in logging in ballots when they are returned. So let's say I vote from home, I send my ballot back, or I drop it off at the drop box, and it gets returned, and I'm waiting for confirmation. And I'm waiting for confirmation, and I'm not getting it. And it's sitting in a box or in a batch somewhere, and I'm still not notified that my ballot has been received. So now I'm starting to freak out because I really want my ballot to count, right? So I may call the Board of Elections and ask them to send me a new one on the assumption that maybe my ballot got lost in the mail. I may show up during early voting or on Election Day because I really want to make sure my ballot counts. And it could be that it's just sitting at the Board of Elections. So we want to make sure that they are logged in a timely manner. So within as soon as practicable and not longer than 2 business days, they should be logged in. And think about the scanner at your grocery store, and it just sort of goes by the reader, and it goes boop, and then you're charged for your milk. Boop, you're charged for your really expensive eggs or your chocolate cake. Boop. So similar concept with your ballot. You're checking that there's a signature. The ballot is cured. It's going to be a valid ballot. It arrived in time. Boop, and just run through them. I have heard about high school students doing community service, student service learning hours. It's not complicated. And then the voter is sent an email or a text or something saying, got your ballot, you're good. We had a 50% increase in provisional ballots this year. And I think one of the contributors to that enormous increase is that people were worried because they hadn't gotten their ballot confirmed as having been received. We will hear from Mayo, the Maryland Association of Election Officials, that internet ballots, internet delivered ballots, and I will do a deeper dive on those with another bill, but internet delivered ballots are complicated. They are more time consuming for the boards of elections. So having those ballots logged in within 2 days, they are making the case that that's unreasonable. I am totally okay. And I've talked to the Mayo representative, the wonderful Ms. Barry, and we think that 4 days, doubling that and doing 4 days just for the internet delivered ballots seems a reasonable compromise. But again, we want to make sure that voters have that. And then lastly, and this is possibly the most important one. Last year, after the emergency regulations, after the lawsuits, after the judicial hearings and all that and rulings, that finally for the general elections, that the local boards could start processing ballots early. There were some that opted not to. What we did here is we were deciding between shall and may and all this stuff, and we came up with a middle ground, which was the language for the bill says shall. You shall start your canvassing, but if you're Garrett County or Somerset County, and you've got 100 mail-in ballots, it doesn't make sense for you to have to hire the people, rent the hall, turn on the TV cameras to live stream and all that. That's a lot of work for not a lot of ballots. So smaller counties or any county, frankly, could seek a waiver from the state administrator of elections, who could grant that waiver saying, yep, you don't have enough to warrant the expense and time and money, so you get a pass. So that's the biggest difference. That's the most important difference, I think, between last year's bill that we enacted and this year's version. And so with that, my intent is to be pretty brief in each of my presentations, but truly, if there are questions, I am happy to take them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, before I call up we've got several witnesses in person, also virtually. Just one quick question about the shall and the 2-day visit. So what's the, it's sort of parlaying a little bit from the last bill with Senator August. So what's the consequence if the Board of Elections does not comply with the timeline that you've outlined in the bill? What's the sanction consequence?
I think I'm going to have confidence that they can do it. Montgomery County has new sorting systems, and they have said that this is easy in their testimony. They said this isn't a problem. Talking to Mayo, the Maryland Association of Election Officials, their only concern was with the internet delivered ballots. So it's just making a priority. Everyone is jammed. Everyone is working hard as it gets closer to Election Day, and then obviously on the other side of Election Day as well. But it's really important so that voters get the confidence, the reassurance that their ballot is going to be counted, has been received. And so the speed of that, I think, is critical. As soon as practicable and not longer than 2 business days. Gives a fair amount of time. And then again, I am willing to accept as a friendly amendment for internet delivered ballots, which are more complicated. Those could be 4 days. So still within 1 business week and not bleeding over into another week.
Questions for our sponsor, the Vice Chair of the committee? Senator Gallion.
Thank you. It's a little bit like Groundhog Day, but just for some of the new folks that are kind of digging into this, maybe a deeper dive than in previous years I just saw on the floor. Can you just kind of go through again? We had a bill earlier from Senator Reedy about double voting, stuff like that. So how does that work if someone mails their ballot, requests a mail, and they're on now this permanent list, right? So they're sending the ballot in, but then they also show up to vote, whether it be on Election Day or early voting. Which votes counted? Is that are these people warned about this? Can you just kind of like the safeguard and give us a...
Thank you, Senator Gallion. That's a really important question. And voters are not, I think, generally ever trying to commit a felony by trying to vote twice. but sometimes they are confused or they are anxious. So this bill makes clear that the first legally sufficient ballot is the one that will be counted. So in my example of I voted by mail, I sent it in, I haven't gotten notification. I'm getting anxious. I'm getting worried. It got lost in the mail. So if I then called the Board of Elections and said, will you send me a new one? And then I vote that one. Or I just say, you know what, forget it. There's not enough time left. I'm just going to show up at the polls and I'm going to early vote, or I'm going to vote on election day. Because if I showed up at the polls or an early voting or on election day, they would be checking the e-poll books, the database of voters, and they would see that I had already had a mail-in ballot sent to me. So even if it's not in their system that it had been returned, because if it had been returned, thank you, but you've already voted, go away, okay? But if it wasn't logged in yet, and I showed up at the polls, the fact that I had been sent a mail-in ballot, maybe I lost it, maybe it got lost in the mail, maybe it's in a box about to be logged in and counted, I would be given a provisional ballot. And that means it would not be put in with the other ballots. It would not be scanned that day. It would be put in another place and put aside. And then they're going to have to go back and figure out, did Kagan vote? Was it the mail-in ballot and it was received? We just hadn't been logged in, but it was legally sufficient and arrived prior? Or is it going to be that the vote that I cast on election day or during early voting, because my mail-in ballot never arrived? Or I didn't cure the ballot, which is another really common thing. Rather than going to the Board of Elections or figuring out how to sign the oath or something, it's just easier. I'm just going to show up and vote that ballot. The first legally sufficient ballot would then be the one I cast in person on election day or on early voting, during early voting. And the one that I mailed in that didn't have the oath signed, didn't have my signature, that one would be tossed. So whichever one is legally accepted and, arrives first and is legal, that's the one. And it's really clear. So no one's going to be able to vote twice. No one's going to be able to change their mind. I had voted for candidate A, but now I really want candidate B. Whichever one arrives first that is compliant with oath and all that is the one that counts. Was that clear enough?
Yeah.
Is that good?
And I should have mentioned at the outset, because some of these issues are technical, we do have our Board of Elections folks here. I'm sure they'd be available to answer any questions that the witnesses or sponsor even, and true of this bill and then the subsequent bills as well.
Absolutely.
I didn't see Jared Demarinis and
Yes.
and some of the folks there. Any additional questions for the sponsor? Okay, seeing none, we're going to next move to the signed up witness list here. We're going to start with Samuela Anse, Jeannie Massey, Morgan Drayton again, and Ralph Watkins, all signed up straight favorable. I'll go through this again. Samuela Anse, Jeannie Massey, Morgan Drayton, Ralph Watkins. That's 4 people, so clearly somebody's not here. And then we'll go, and actually, since we have one additional witness signed up, just information only, why don't we bring him up here, David Naiman. Oh, actually, I apologize. You know what? I think I'm on the wrong. I think I'm on the wrong bill here. I apologize. Here, strike everything that I just said. I'm on the next Kagan bill. Okay, here's who I meant to call. Okay, we're gonna go Jeannie Massey, Morgan Drayton, Emily Scarr, and Jim Shalek, who I do see in the back. So that is correct. And so there is some clear overlap. I apologize. And those are 4 witnesses signed up straight favorable. So Ms. Drayton, why don't you lead off, and then we'll go down the aisle, and then we'll go next to a panel of favorable with amendment folks. Okay.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Again, for the record, Morgan Drayton here on behalf of Common Cause Maryland. I can keep my testimony short on this one. Common Cause supported this bill last year all the way to the governor's desk, and we definitely plan to do so again this session. According to SBE data, Maryland voters requested more than 64,000, mail-in ballots during the 2022 general election, and we're sure to see this number increase as we head towards the 2024 presidential elections. And with that in mind, we believe that it's important to take the necessary measures now to pass a permanent legislative solution to support our state and local election boards in the secure administration of our elections. SB 379 provides these common sense steps that will improve our mail-in voting process and addresses issues that have long been faced by voters, especially those in vulnerable communities like the elderly, students, and those voters with disabilities who have long relied on this method of voting. And for those reasons, we would request a favorable report. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, and esteemed committee. My name is Jeannie Massey. I come to you from Washington County, where I am by trade a social studies teacher. And I can tell you one of the most influential experiences I had that informed my teaching was being an election judge. Barry Jackson, who's here today from Washington County Board of Elections, trusted me as a check-in judge, same-day registration judge, provisional judge, and a chief judge in a tiny little polling place. So it's not that important, but it is important. And the processes that we are trained to follow and that we experience as citizen servants are so thorough. And this bill does so much to simply tweak the existing process to make it clean and fair and transparent in every way possible, following best practices from around the country. I live in a community that's very divided politically, and making sure that our elections are as transparent, clear, and showing every step along the way as a best practice increases trust. And trust is not very high right now for our election officials, and they are some of the most ethical professionals I know in this world. So I urge you to make a favorable report.
Why don't you, there you go. Tell us who you are, and you've got 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Emily Scar. I'm the Director of Maryland PIRG, the State Public Interest Group. We want to thank everyone who supported this bill last year and hope you will do so again. As Vice Chair Kagan explained, the bill is a needed response to the increase in mail-in voting that we're seeing. Enabling local boards of election to tabulate ballots before election day is just crucial for our public confidence in election and making sure that they are certified on time. My written testimony also has stats on the need for curing and how this process worked in 2022, as well as the number of folks who forgot to sign their mail-in ballots in the 2020 election, et cetera. So we respectfully request a favorable report.
Okay, Mr. Shallak, good to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman Kagan. I'm Jim Shallak. I recently was the president of the Montgomery County Board of Elections. I served for 6 years. We had a lot of bumps in the road. We had a pandemic. We had a lot of issues, but we got through it. I want to thank Senator Kagan for her leadership. For 6 years, she's been at the front of helping us. And we had a Republican board, a strong Republican board. She was always there for us at our meetings. A real leader in our state on election law. Thank you. Anyway, the proof is in the numbers. Election day, Biden against Trump, big day. I didn't sleep for like 3 days, worrying about the crowds, riots, whatever. I woke up on election day, went around to the polls, nothing. There's nobody in line. We had about 540,000 votes for president, Biden or Trump, more than 10 states, I was told. And at the end of the day, 40,000 people voted on election day. 500,000 voters had already voted when people went to the polls on election day. Election day is on its way out. Election day this could be a death knell. People love early voting. The numbers are astronomical. About 513,000 mail-in ballots for governor this year. Montgomery County, I got the numbers. I think they had about 118,000 mail-in ballots. 4 years ago in a general election, they had 37,000, 4 times as many early voters and mail-in ballots. In 5-10 years, election day is going to be the past. Nobody's going to vote on election day. Anyway, the staff does a tremendous job, these volunteers working sometimes 10, 12 hours a day. The stress of all these mail-in ballots coming in, which they can't even open until Thursday after the election, is a tremendous burden on them. But more important is the delay in reporting the results. It took weeks for us to get through and give our results. I think we may have been last in the state. That's not fair. You know, you turn on CNN, 8 seconds after the polls close, they predict a winner. Maryland, you don't get a result, total result for weeks. It's going to be Christmas time if we don't adopt this bill. Crucial, good government, and bipartisan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Shalek. Any questions for any of the panelists? Senator Gallion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This kind of addressed Mr. Shalek talking about election day going out. So I real quick pulled up the numbers from just the gubernatorial this most recent year. Early voting, almost 380,000 Marylanders. Election day, over 1 million. So still not quite out yet. Mail-in ballot was 513,000. So if anything, I'm just wondering, and maybe you could address this, I think maybe the early voting with the major increase in mail-in balloting, and it's here, people seem like it's going to stay here. Should we maybe look at tweaking the early voting as it is needed now, since everybody's doing the mail-in? Why spend all this money to have all these places open for 6 or however many days for early voting when so many folks are now doing mail-in?
Right. Thank you. Again, great question. There are people who believe that early voting is not the best use of our resources. At the same time, people are talking about voting centers because there are fewer of those. So in Montgomery County, we have what, like 12 or 13 early voting centers now, 14 versus 300 and something precincts. So in terms of a cost, the early voting sites are a better use of, of geographically appropriate and dispersed and accessible. All of those things have to be managed. Whether or not that's the way to go, I'm going to suggest that that's not this bill and is something that should be explored potentially in the future. I think that we are still waiting on data in a post-pandemic world to see whether these numbers continue. And I neglected to mention, so 2018 in the primary, 30,122 ballots were cast by mail statewide, 30,000. And in 2022's primary, after COVID and all that, this is 364,114. It was 10 times as many, more than 10 times as many mail-in ballots than had been just 4 years earlier in the same election. So it is potentially the wave of the future. We'll see that a little bit. There's a to be determined, I think.
It's probably not a bill for this year, but I think Oregon was it was a 10-year project. The state of Oregon is 100. It's all mail-in.
Right. There's six states now, 7 states
that are all mail-in.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not going to get them all from
that didn't happen
now,
overnight, but to the point of the trend line.
I think Utah's the most recent.
Okay. So okay, that's good to know. Any other questions, panel? Okay, seeing none, we do have one more live witness. We've got David Naiman here, signed up favorable with amendments or an amendment. Mr. Naiman, why don't you?
Glad
come
he's
up?
live.
Yeah, he's in person, and then we do have 3 virtual witnesses after that. But
I appreciate that vote in favor of my life. Thank
okay,
you.
so Mr. Naiman, you have 2.5 minutes. Again, you're signed up favorable with amendments.
Okay, well, let me first use a few seconds to say it's great to be here, Mr. Chairman. It's great to be able to call you that. It's been a long time coming for you to have that position, and I'm glad to see that. And Madam Vice Chair, my longtime friend, everyone just got a good dose of your level of knowledge on elections, which was truly impressive. And there is no elected official who attends more Montgomery County Board of Elections meetings, probably no elected official who attends more Maryland State Board of Elections meetings. She definitely knows her stuff about elections. If I had known about the amendment on the web delivered ballots, I might have been here just supporting the legislation. I will say that I did some consulting with folks in Montgomery County. We have more of everything. We have more voters, more ballots, more mail-in ballots, and we have way too many web delivered ballots. I say too many only because I'm expressing a personal opinion of someone who has to process those ballots. I do think voters should have their own options as to how they do that. I don't know whether 4 business days is sufficient or not. I will be consulting with people, but I understand what Mayo says. We are as you know, we are the jurisdiction that has more of this than anybody. I do want to add one part to this that's really important. I want to thank our county government and the State Board of Elections for the mail sorting equipment that Montgomery County started using in 2022, which really is the only way that we're able to say that it's realistic to try and get ballots marked as received faster. Senator Kagan knows that I've been Johnny One Note about trying to get those ballots marked faster. The mail sorting equipment, when it's used to its fullest capacity, can actually can beep in the ballots instead of having to use the scanner, the supermarket type scanner that Senator Kagan described. And in that, but that's only for the US mail ballots, not for the web delivered ballots. They don't all fit into the machine the same way. But that the ability of that machine to communicate with MD voters is the difference between being able to do this and not being able to do this. We processed about 50,000 mail-in ballots before Election Day for the general election in 2018. We just finished our certification on November 30th. The school board was sworn in on December the 1st. As you can tell, we were just in the nick of time. I want to thank Senator Kagan for making sure everybody knew about the governor's veto and the courts for allowing us to do that. We will have a big problem in 2024 if we don't have something like this legislation to allow us to start early. Last thing is, it depends on the voters casting their votes earlier, not doing it at the last minute. I'm a procrastinator myself. You can see because I'm at the time right now. But I will say that unless we have a lot more voters voting earlier in the process, you could let us count ballots 30 days before the election, but there are no ballots to count. So in order for us to be able to take full advantage of that provision, we really need the voters to vote earlier. But this legislation is sorely needed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Damon. Questions for our witness? Okay, seeing none, we're going to.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
just two
sir.
wrap-up
Yes.
comments if I could.
Absolutely.
One is I just talked to Mayo, the Maryland Association of Election Officials this morning, literally this morning, which is why it wasn't in my testimony, that I think a different standard for internet delivered ballots was appropriate. So I'm sorry that you didn't know about that. And then, and I lost the other thing. We're good.
You know where to find us. Okay, we do have 3 virtual witnesses. We're gonna bring them in through Zoom. Linda Cohn is up, number 1. Ms. Cohn, you are up. You've got 2.5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. My name is Linda Cohn. I'm representing the League of Women Voters today. And I'm offering our support for Senate Bill 379 on early processing of ballots. Last session, this body worked to enable early processing of ballots. We have even more information now about how voters are using mail-in ballots by looking at the 2018 and 2022 elections. And you already heard the numbers on that, so I'm not going to go ahead and repeat them again. But clearly there was a big jump in the use of mail-in voting between just 2018 and 2022. And it's that reason that Senate Bill 379 remains very timely and very important. The League supports early processing of ballots for 2 reasons. First, it helps the voters by allowing an opportunity for ballot curing to start closer to the time they actually cast their ballot. It's more proximate. Secondly, it helps the boards of elections get their work done. Early processing gives them the time they need to handle the added work that comes from a significantly greater volume of mailed-in ballots. They still have to make sure they meet the deadline for certifying the election, and this allows them to do that. So because the bill helps both the voters and the boards of elections, the League of Women Voters urges a favorable report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Cohn. Any questions for the witness? Okay, seeing none, we're going to next go to Alan Banoff, Montgomery County, signed up favorable. Mr. Banoff, going to look for you, and you signed up again favorable.
Okay.
Not gonna do the video.
Yep,
Okay.
okay, we found you there.
Okay,
Welcome,
very
you're
good.
here. You've got
Thank
2.5
you.
minutes, Mr. Banov.
Good afternoon, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, and committee members. I'm Alan Banov. I'm a Democratic member of the Montgomery County Board of Elections, but I testify here as an individual in support of SB 379, one of Senator Kagan's bills. The current law unduly prevents local boards from timely processing mail-in ballots, although they've become quite popular, as you've been hearing, especially during the pandemic, and they've picked up since then. Last year, as explained in my written statement, the Montgomery County Board received 118,530 mail-in ballots in the gubernatorial election. That represented about 36% of the total votes. Statewide, 541,990 mail-in ballots were counted. That's about 28% of the total votes. My statement also reminds you of the many elaborate steps which local board employees and canvassers must take to process and canvass mail-in ballots before tabulating them. I count at least 10 human steps to process a normal mail-in ballot before it's scanned. For a problematic ballot, it'd be even more. Even though the courts allowed local boards to begin processing and canvassing on October 1st, even though the county board began canvassing October 15, 8 business days before early voting, and even though we canvassed on 18 days, we needed all of that time. We completed the canvass, as you've heard, on November 28th, and we certified the county results on November 30, the day before our new County Board of Education was sworn in. For these reasons and those set forth in my written statement, I urge you to report favorably SB 379 so as to require local boards to begin processing mail-in ballots 8 business days before the first day of early voting. In my written statement, I suggested you may want to amend the bill to provide that local boards may begin processing mail-in ballots 8 days before early voting. On further review, I'm comfortable with requiring local boards to start their canvasses then, since the bill also allows waivers from this requirement. Also, 379 has a good provision to require the SBE to sign their oath to adopt regulations requiring local boards to notify mail-in voters of their failures to sign their oaths on their timely submitted envelopes and to give them a chance to correct their errors. That's already the policy of the Montgomery County Board, at least with respect to regular mail-in ballots. Attempting to cure web-based ballots, especially if the voters are overseas, can be problematic. 4 business days is better than 2 anyway, maybe more. Hope this committee will report the bill favorably. Thank you for considering my testimony.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Banov. Any questions for the witness? Okay, seeing none, we're going to go to our final witness who signed up favorable with amendments, and that's Catherine Berry. Ms. Berry? Okay, better yet, you signed up virtual, so okay, you still have 2.5 minutes in person.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Catherine Berry. I'm here now to represent the Maryland Association of Election Officials. We appreciate Senator Kagan's willingness to work with us on this amendment that she's been talking about. I'm not really going to cover all of the other aspects of the bill, other than to say that to the greatest extent possible, the local boards of elections work around the clock, making sure that we are accessible and that the voters know, what is going on with their ballots. And so, we will work on getting these timeframes. We understand the importance of it. And we are, looking forward to the ability to start canvass officially. We have been curing ballots for at least 2 elections. This will codify that language. And again, we do that to the greatest extent possible because of staffing issues and all of those other things. I also would just like to mention that we also appreciate the ability to have the waiver for starting canvass early, because we do recognize sometimes there are mailing issues and the smaller local boards have a greater amount of resources that are needed. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has about the bill, but thank you for allowing me today.
Okay, any questions for Ms. Berry? Senator Simonaire.
Thank you for being here. Your testimony caught my attention. You said you've been curing currently. Under state law, it says you cannot accept a ballot. That's state law. So under what authority were you curing them?
Right. I believe there was regulation that was put into place before the 2022 election. So when we cure the ballots prior to the election as it currently stands, we can review the back of those ballots that come back and we can see if a signature was put on or not. So we can jumpstart just recognizing whether a signature needs to be cured, give that extra time of time for the voter to come in as long as it's 10 days after the election. As far as the web delivered ballots, because we could not pre-canvass in advance, the web delivered ballots, we don't know if they have to cure the signatures inside the envelope. And that is something that we would do after the canvass were to start. But it did prove to be beneficial when, ballots are trickling in prior to the start of early voting, recognizing that a signature is needed and then jumping on that. It does take a bit of time to cure ballots.
Okay, just to follow up on that, because I don't completely know that process.
Sure.
If the state law specifically in general says that there's a process in place that says you must reject a ballot if the signature is not on there, how can regulation go and trump state law and say, actually, you can do that? Was there a court? I mean, I just help me through that process.
I'm going to defer over to Jared or Jen from the state board. That was a regulation.
Well, that's why we have our crack whip State Board of Elections folks here to answer all these kinds of questions. So Jared, if you'd like to, and by the way, why don't you tell us your name and so everybody's watching this online can know who you are.
Sure, thank
You
you.
didn't just show up, out of the lobby to answer this question.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, Jared Damaris, Director of Candidacy and Campaign Finance for the Maryland State Board of Elections. So the first part was the curing, and that started in 2020 because we had an all-mail election, and that was under the purviews of the executive order from the proclamation from the governor at that point. And then it was continued on with the curing after that for the 2022 election. And basically, it notifies the voter of a deficiency, saying, you come in, sign it, because at that point there, the canvass has not begun for the absentee ballot 1 or the absentee ballot 2, which is why they are allowed to do that. At the time of the canvass, if there is no signature on that ballot, then those ballots would not count. So the curing process it's not, I would say, contradictory, or it's just of state law. It's just filling in the vacancy. State law doesn't say upon receipt, if it doesn't have a signature, it has to be rejected immediately. It just has to be rejected at the canvass if it doesn't have the signature. So when they're receiving this, the local boards are looking at it going, you're not signing it, contact the voter to make sure that their vote is counted before that it goes to the Board of Canvassers to actually be counted or to be actually, I guess, adjudicated at that point.
And we can probably talk more offline,
Yes.
Jared, but just so I understand that in 2020, Governor then Hogan authorized curing of a signature not being on a ballot through his executive order.
No, I think it was basically he authorized the full mail-in voting. At that point, we then the state board had emergency regulations on the process for curing, because we've never had such a high volume of mail-in ballots. So before, you used to have about 5 to 6% of people use mail-in ballots. Now it was 100%, and it was a part of, I guess, voter education to make sure. I mean, we had a major push there to make sure that you sign these oaths here as well. But it was just the envelope. It's,
Okay, so just so I understand the process, it was the governor's executive order said we can do mail-in ballots, and the Board of Elections had emergency regulations. And in those regulations, they said that they can do curing if somebody did not have a signature.
correct. And all these regs are also vetted with the Attorney General's office as well to make sure.
Okay, and
to be
then in
compliant with-
22, there was another executive order on mail-in.
No, I think we just then made those regs permanent
Okay.
at that point there. Again, vetted with the Attorney General to ensure compliance with state law.
Okay, we can talk more.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
And just to be clear, colleagues, the only time that your signing an oath on a ballot envelope is obviously if you're voting by mail. So if you're voting during early voting or in person, there's no curing needed because you're there and it can be fixed right away. It's only when you're not there and you've submitted your ballot through the mail or at a drop-off box.
Any additional questions for our guest from the State Board of Elections or Ms. Berry or the sponsor? Seeing none, that concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 379. Senator Kagan, stay right where you are. We are going to move to Senate Bill 39. And you've got the time you need to present it, and then we'll call up some witnesses after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, colleagues. For the record, Senator Cheryl Kagan, very proud to represent the residents of Gaithersburg and Rockville. Some of these are easier and quicker, but that canvassing bill was an important emergency bill. This one, ballot access is what I call it. Some of you may find this familiar because I've brought it in the past, but it is different than in the past. So I just want to ask you for a clean slate here so that I can explain this bill. The reality is that about 20% of Maryland voters are unaffiliated, 834,325. And most of those are new citizens or young voters or new residents or first-time voters, and they don't realize that Maryland has closed primaries. So let me be clear, we have closed primaries. This does not change closed primaries, nor do I think it should. I like closed primary. I think if you want to be on my team and you want to vote for my team's leader, it's like you have to be on the team and you can't flip and flop and all that. So this does not change that. The problem is that in many parts of Maryland, and I would venture to say most parts of Maryland, the key election is in the primary. So either an area is bright red and they're gonna elect Republicans, or it's bright blue and they're gonna elect Democrats. So if you can't vote in a primary, you are essentially not voting, because in the general election, basically in your area, the decisions have been made. So here's the thing, and what makes me just really concerned about this issue is that there are two voters. One just moved into Maryland from out of state. The other is a lifelong Maryland resident. The out-of-state person can show up on election day. That person can register to vote, choose a political party, and vote the entire ballot. Just arrived. They've been here a couple of months. The lifelong Marylander who is registered as unaffiliated shows up during early voting or on primary election day, and they are given a ballot for the Board of Education. And that's it. They can't vote for president or governor or state senator, even county executive. They can't vote for any of the other races in the primary that would be on a partisan affiliated voter. This ballot and this bill, and I've brought it before because ultimately I believe that at any time that this voter, this new voter wants to register, affiliate, and cast a partisan ballot, I think that a lifelong Marylander should be able to do the same, but that has not flown. So what we're proposing is just to allow it to shift forward a little bit so that the deadline for someone who decides that they are so inspired that they want to vote for or against a person in the primary, that rather than 21 days in advance, which is early, and not, a lot of people aren't paying as close attention as we are 3 weeks before Election Day, move it up to 5 p.m. the day before the start of early voting. So let me tell you what that means. Up until 5 o'clock, and it can be 2 months in advance, it can be 3 weeks in advance, it can be the day before the start of early voting. I am going from unaffiliated to affiliating with either of the parties. The next day, the start of early voting, I can show up and I can cast a complete ballot. Now that I've changed my affiliation, I am that party person. I changed and I am now a Republican or I am now a Democrat. And if I don't take proactive action That will be my affiliation going forward unless I change again for some reason. There's some people who say, oh my God, what if thousands of people, thousands, all hordes, everyone who's unaffiliated decides at 4:59 PM, the night before early voting, that they suddenly want to affiliate. And I assure you that I think that that is supremely unlikely. Even if that were to happen, and our local boards of elections are drowning, trying to process all these, and let's say they couldn't, and I think it's likely to be more like 10. But let's say they couldn't. If I show up the next morning at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, the first moment that early voting starts, I would say, hi, I'd like the Republican or Democratic ballot because I've switched parties and now I want to vote the whole ballot. And they would say, like we haven't updated the e-poll book, so we still show you as unaffiliated. And I said, no, I just changed. I just changed yesterday. I'm good. I want to vote the full ballot. I would be given a provisional ballot and that would count because I would have changed my party affiliation on time. So in the worst case scenario, the voter still gets to make his or her views known and get full access to a ballot. So I just want to give you quick data. In 2022, in the gubernatorial primary, 2,546 of almost 8,000 ballots, provisional ballots, were rejected, 32% based on voted in the wrong party primary. So I showed up, I was unaffiliated. I said, no, I really want to vote in this or that party. And they say, yeah, you're not, you can't. Well, I want to vote anyway because people are frustrated and they get angry. And so the judge doesn't want to pick the battle. They say, okay, fine. Well, then you can vote provisionally, but let me be clear, your vote will not count because you are not eligible to vote in this primary. Despite all that, 32.1% of people insisted and voted a party primary. In 2020, that number was 1,333 out of 4,800 and change. 27.6% of the provisional ballots were rejected because they voted in a party primary and were not eligible. And that was in a 100% mail-in ballot. So voters were sent their correct ballot. So these were people who actually came and voted in person rather than doing it by mail and insisted on a party ballot. 2018, I'm just going to give you two more numbers, 55.9%. It was 4,321 ballots out of 7,729 total provisional ballots were rejected. 55.9% rejected because they insisted on a party ballot and were not eligible. And 2016, that's the last one I'll give you, 9,292 out of 24,770 total provisional ballots, 37.5% of the ballots that were provisional were rejected for the reason of voting in the wrong party primary. These are people who want to cast a ballot. They want to be heard. They want to express their views and not just for school board. And school board is totally important. I am not in any way disrespecting it, but they want to vote to have the nominee for president, for county executive, for US Senate, for state Senate and others. So, so this would not overburden our local boards of elections. It would just let people unaffiliated folks, 20% of our constituents vote. And I will close with reading a paragraph from Common Cause. And I know that Morgan Drayton is here, and so she may want to say this again, but currently registered unaffiliated voters who would like to register under a recognized political party in order to participate in Maryland's closed primary process must do so 21 days before the election. However, unregistered voters may show up in the week before the election, register, and choose a party affiliation. And that's the week before the election or on election day. The disparity created by the deadline for unaffiliated voters is arbitrary, confusing, and an unnecessary burden. With that, Mr. Chair, there are other folks who have submitted testimony. I'm happy to take any questions either before or after we hear from our witnesses.
Okay, we're going to start with Senator Gallion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Vice Chair, so I was just kind of reading through this and you're definitely a subject matter expert on this. So I wanted to get your take on this. So this is just dealing with unaffiliated voters that
Yes.
later in the game decide they want to change and become a member of a party. where does the law stand with, let's say I'm a Democrat and the polls are campaign advertisers coming out and I'm seeing this stuff in a Republican primary. And I'm like, you know what? I want to switch. I want to switch my party affiliation from one party to the other. How does that kind of fit in with this?
Thank you, Senator Gallion. That would not be affected by this bill. This only touches unaffiliated voters. So if you're a Democrat and would rather vote in the Republican primary, or a Republican who wants to vote in the Democratic Party, you've got to do it in advance. You've got to do the 21 days in advance.
So why wouldn't that be also in line to be changed with this? So anybody that decides they want to change, whether it be from unaffiliated to one of the parties or from one party, why wouldn't it all be at the same date?
So unaffiliated voters can't vote for anything other than the Board of Education unless they are affiliated. So if you are registered as a Republican or if you are registered as a Democrat, you can come in, mail-in ballot, in person during early voting or on primary election day, and you can vote an entire ballot. If you are unaffiliated, part of the 20% of Marylanders who are registered unaffiliated because they didn't know we had closed primaries, or in the country they came from, choosing the wrong party could mean that your family could get murdered. I mean, there are reasons people choose not to affiliate, and then they're here and they understand and they really want to engage. But they're not paying attention 3 weeks out, 4 weeks out, 2 months out. So it's just giving them an extra week to come in and choose a side. And then they can change back. They can decide they want to be unaffiliated again, or they can change to the other party. But it's just an invitation to allow those to be able to fully participate in democracy. And this is especially important for young voters and first-time voters who really just aren't informed.
If I may, Mr. Chair. So if I'm registered in as a party member, whether it be Democrat or
Yeah.
Republican, and I'm looking and seeing that, okay, I don't really have any choices in my primary. All these decisions are going to be made in the opposite party primary. I want us to go where the action is. Why shouldn't I have that same opportunity like you would give an unaffiliated voter up to that same deadline?
Again, Senator Gallion, that's not this bill. And that would basically be open primaries. There are people who believe in sort of cynically or deviously, strategically, whatever adverb you want to use, ooh, I want to vote, I want to switch parties and vote for the other guy's weakest candidate. And so that means, then we'll win. My party will actually win. But so I'll help that happen by voting for the other guys. I can do that. I just have to decide pretty early. And I don't think most voters are that devious. So it's just for the 20% of people who otherwise would really not be allowed to cast a ballot. And referencing, there was, maybe before you were here, I think, there was a Kagan-Hershey bill that got signed into law that we called the Informed Voter Act. And because a lot of people don't know that we have closed primaries, we required that on the voter registration form and online, it says right next to pick a party, it says, if you don't pick a party, you are probably not going to be able to vote in a primary or participate in a caucus if we ever had caucuses. So despite that, people may not know, they may not be aware of the implications of their decision to not affiliate with a party. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to Senator Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator, two things. First of all, would you agree that a lot of the provisional ballots occur once the individual comes to, when it's time to vote, and then therefore really wouldn't necessarily be impacting the 5? I mean, given that I'm just talking about like the numbers that you presented, would you agree that that will still probably be the case for a large group of provisionals in the way that you've talked about it?
It's a great question. My ideal is that they would be able to change and affiliate and vote a full ballot on election day. I haven't been able to pass that. That would solve the problem for all of these thousands and thousands of voters who are voting in the wrong primary because they're not eligible. So that would be the solution. And if this committee, this new awesome committee, sees that as the wisdom of this committee, I'm going to be the first to, shout hallelujah. That would solve the problem. So we can cut into this by giving folks an extra week or something closer to election day. There was concern, oh my gosh, if tens of thousands of people all come in last second and it would be a huge burden. I don't think any of that is realistic. But we are talking about thousands of voters who are disenfranchised.
Okay, but that is a part of my follow-up though.
Yes.
So a part of my follow-up is that, I worked with and talked to my folks at the Board of Elections, and you are putting this at like the most challenging time for our folks at the Board of Elections that they have. Like, it is just the most challenging time for them when they're trying to get themselves together for the following morning. Did you consider that as far as in the timing of this? Like, it really is a hard time for them.
Totally valid question and valid issue. We talked with a lot of people about this. Trying to cut the baby in half here to make the opportunity as close to election day as possible, and yet not creating some of the challenges that have proved detrimental in this issue. So again, in just Prince George's County, how many people are going to wait until the very last second and switch? 10? Like, we're not talking about massive millions of folks here. And even if the local board says, we are doing other stuff, we are not going to deal with these 10 people and updating the e-poll books, the database, to make sure that these 10 people are now registered with a party. Even if that doesn't happen, and again, for 10 people, it may not be that complicated, but even for those 10 people, if they all showed up the very next morning and didn't wait until the 4th day of early voting, or didn't wait until election day to vote, when the e-poll books would presumably be updated, they would be given a provisional ballot, which would then be accepted because they would have changed parties in time to be casting a complete ballot. And so it's a solvable problem, and it's not going to be big numbers. Thank you.
Okay, Senator Carozza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Kagan, for sharing this information about the process. I want to go back to the point that you made in your testimony. You first kind of referenced these 10, but you had said earlier in your testimony that with the current political makeup of Maryland, with so many of these districts being determined in primaries, which is a whole different discussion, because I think there should be balance, and that didn't come to bear in redistricting. But going back to where we are right now, with our current makeup, I think there would be maybe multiple situations where there would be a much higher influx of people requesting to be able to vote in a primary, because they'll realize the race itself is the primary, and the candidates will realize the race itself is the primary, and they will do direct mail and email and texts and advertising to actually say, you can, go ahead and register up until the day before, and going back to Senator Augustine's point about at a most stressful period. So I don't think the example of it might be only 10 is really the reality of the current makeup of our districts.
So it's a thoughtful question. Here's the reality. Since most of us have finite number of dollars in our campaign accounts, what would we be spending money on? So for me, am I going to get more Democrats to come to the polls in the primary? Or am I going to try to reach out to unaffiliated people to ask them to switch parties to become a Democrat in time so that they can then vote for me in a primary? It's a lot more work, and it is not going to yield very many benefits. We are really going to talk about a handful. It is going to be more it's going to be more strategic to get your people to vote. This is in the primary, not in the general. So everyone knows, but folks watching from home saying, why is she only talking about the primary? In the general election, voters can vote for anyone in any party. An unaffiliated person can vote back and forth and over and around. Democrats can vote for Republicans. Republicans can love the Democratic candidates. That's all easy. This is in the primary, where the race is, in the Maryland gubernatorial primary. Last year, there were 10 people on the ballot. And I don't remember now, there were a couple who dropped off before then, but 10 candidates. By the time you get to the general election, you have one Democrat and one Republican, and maybe there's a write-in, or maybe there's an independent for a race, but generally you've narrowed it down. In the primary is where the voters are going to pick their standard bearer. And so reaching out to unaffiliated voters to ask them to go online to pick, to change in time is a heavy lift. I'm not saying it's impossible. And if you've got millions and millions of dollars, you could do it, but it's not going to yield very much.
Candidate thinks they're in trouble, they're going to target those unaffiliated voters. Anyway, I understand your point, but I think there's another point to be recognized.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Senator Hester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to thank the senator for bringing this bill. In my district, there's over 20,000 unaffiliated voters. And when I talk to them, they often aren't aware that they have to switch before the primary. So I think this is a very important bill. And I'd love actually to have some of that data. Would you be willing to share that with us all?
Oh my golly, of course. And I should have said the source. It all comes from the State Board of Elections website. It is publicly accessible. So anyone watching in this room, but Senator Hester, I'd be happy to give that to you, because it is shocking. And frankly, I didn't bring that data in last year or the year before, whenever I brought this bill last. And it's not insignificant. It is not symbolic when we're talking about tens of thousands of voters whose ballots were completely rejected because they didn't vote. They weren't eligible to vote in a primary.
Okay, any additional questions for sponsor? Seeing none, we're going to next move to signed up witnesses in person. So I'll read your names. You'll come up to Samuela Onse, Jeannie Massey, Morgan Drayton, Ralph Watkins, 4 witnesses. And we'll have one additional witness, Mr. Naaman, after that when we're done with this panel. Okay, so Ms. Drayton, since you've earned your keep here today, we're going to start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Again, for the record, my name is Morgan Drayton here on behalf of Common Cause Maryland. To provide testimony in support of SB 39. As Senator Kagan pointed out earlier, our position is that the disparities created by this deadline for those hundreds of thousands of unaffiliated voters is confusing and is an unnecessary burden on them. While those hundreds of thousands of Marylanders can freely participate in this general election, they are unable to meaningfully participate within Maryland's closed primary system the way the law stands now. And in the state, as Senator Kagan pointed out, where the demographic realities and partisan gerrymandering basically guarantee many races to certain parties, that means that unaffiliated voters are basically just shut out from the most important election of the cycle. So we believe that this bill would allow more voters to have a meaningful impact on the democratic process in a way that would not materially affect the state's current preference for closed primaries. So with that, we strongly support this bill and would request a favorable report. Thank you.
Okay, ma'am, tell us your name.
Thank you, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, sponsor, and members of the committee. My name is Samuela Ansa, and I am the voting rights advocate at Disability Rights Maryland, where we work to advance the rights of all Marylanders with disabilities. And I'm happy to be here testifying in support of Senate Bill 39. This past election cycle, I had the opportunity to extend voter registration to residents in a few state hospitals. And whenever I do register voters, new and old, I go through the entire form with them. And when we get to the bottom is when there are usually questions about affiliating with a political party and what a closed primary means. And this brings up some confusion and some pressure for new voters who haven't decided what party best aligns with their values or what each party represents. They either feel pressure to make an uninformed decision or to not vote in that election. Senate Bill 39 will give only unaffiliated voters the chance to make a decision to affiliate past the voter registration deadline up until early voting, giving them the chance to make an informed decision to cast a ballot in our closed primary elections. So for these reasons, we urge a favorable report on Senate Bill 39. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Why don't you pass the mic to your left?
Good afternoon, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, esteemed committee members. I had a script and I've thrown it out, and I want to tell you about being in Washington County and having, oh, I am Jeannie Massey, all of it, Massey. Yes, she has chastised me before. I want to acknowledge that those voters do come up. You have to talk them into a provisional ballot. They don't want a provisional ballot and they can't vote in the primary because they're unaffiliated. In Washington County, it's 25% of our voters. And I'll tell you why. For the most part, those young voters are the unaffiliated ones. And my kid is a good example. My kid, who's now 18 and will vote next time, when they went to the MVA and on the third try got their driver's license, the question at the end, do you want to register to vote? And the MVA staff member doesn't give them any details. Do you want to register? Yes or no? Are you a citizen? Yes or no? Do you want to affiliate with a party? Yes or no? And my child, who's very well versed in all of this political stuff, because I torture her, said, I think I want to be unaffiliated. And I explained the primary deal to her, and she still was not sure. And it's not your fault. The national climate is contributing to a rise in unaffiliated voters all over the country. It is accelerating, it's escalating, and these young people may figure it out at the last minute that they want to vote in a primary. And if they do, we need to empower them so that they come back, so that they engage. I don't know that the last minute upload to the ePoll books is perfect, but we need to do something to make it possible for unaffiliated voters to vote. And if we're not going to move towards a hybrid or an open primary, let's give this bill a chance. I urge a favorable report.
Sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Ralph Watkins. I'm representing the League of Women Voters of Maryland. I guess the one thing I would say is you don't want any regulation or requirement to be a trap for the unwary. And for those not familiar with voter registration and election procedures, the requirement to select a party before you vote in its primary is unfamiliar to a lot of people. I, through the League of Women Voters, do a lot of voter registration back in Montgomery County, and regularly I see voters, as they're filling out the form, pause when they get to the select a party. And if we have a little conversation, and we usually do, I can explain. If you want to vote in a party's primary, you must pick that party. If you don't pick one, you can't vote in primary at all. As long as we have the conversation, people are ready to make the choice. But as other people have alluded to, many more people are registering at MVA or otherwise online, and there's no human being. You don't get the same chance to have the conversation. At MVA, you have somebody. Yes, you have a human being, but their specialty is motor vehicle law, not election law. So this additional opportunity, it's limited, as already described, feels very important to allow voters to exercise their fundamental right to vote. We urge a favorable report on this bill. Thank you.
Any questions for our panel? Okay, seeing none. And by the way, I should have mentioned to the committee that if you're really enjoying the topic area, we will be having a briefing next Wednesday from none other than the State Board of Elections. So this will come up again next Wednesday. With that, we're going to have one additional witness. So you all are dismissed. We've got David Naiman here signed up just for information purposes. So I'm not sure what information you want to impart on us, Mr. Naiman, but you've got 2.5 minutes to tell us what you want to tell us.
Thank you for that. My name is David Naiman. I am the secretary and the Democratic leader of the Montgomery County Board of Elections, but I'm testifying today only on behalf of myself. I'm not taking a position on the policy question of whether unaffiliated voters should be allowed to change their party affiliation after the current deadline of 3 weeks before Election Day. I'm just here to point out a few practical considerations, some of which have already been mentioned. The first one is that while if Senator Kagan is correct that we are only going to get 10 requests on the last night before early voting, that will be quite manageable. If others are correct that there'll be many more, this bill would require essentially overnight service in terms of doing that. And if those changes are submitted on paper, that process is a little bit more time consuming. It is true, as Senator Kagan said, that those voters can vote provisionally. I thought that a part of what you guys were doing today was to try to have fewer provisional ballots. I know you'll be doing us a big favor if there's fewer provisional ballots. So that's something to consider. I believe it was Senator Augustine who made the excellent point about how busy our election staff is in that time period right before early voting. In addition to preparing and transporting equipment for early voting, we are collecting ballots from drop boxes, in our case across the county. We are processing the ballots when they come back to our office. We are sending ballots to people who have requested them, and we're hopefully recruiting and retaining election judges for both early voting and Election Day. And if, as I hope, you are going to enact Senate Bill 379 to allow us to start canvassing mail-in ballots 8 days before early voting begins, we will also be in the midst of preparation and the process for canvassing those ballots. We also will be contacting people to help them to cure their ballots if they don't sign their oath. So it is a particularly busy time. And then as far as I think this is the point that Senator Gallion was making about this legislation does give a right of sorts to unaffiliated voters that it doesn't give to Democrats and Republicans. Democrats and Republicans, if they want to change their party affiliation, they do so 21 days in advance. In this case, you'd have to do it 13 days. Unaffiliated voters would be allowed to go until 13 days in advance, rather than the 21 days in advance for everyone else. My example would be if the presidential primary and one party gets clinched during that time period in between, you could get a rush of voters who want to vote in the party primary of the still contested presidential nomination. So sorry for going over, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Naiman. Any questions for the witness? Okay, seeing none, that concludes bill hearing on Senate Bill 39, and we're going to next move to Senate Bill 111 and Senator Kagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this one's going to be briefer and less complex. For the record, because each of these can be stored or watched separately, Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville, with a bill that came up actually at a State Board of Elections meeting, and the Republican chair of the committee, who knew that I was attending the online meeting, said, if there's a legislator listening, we sure could use a law for this. And this is related to exploratory and draft committees. It's a loophole that needs to be closed. So let's say there's an effort to draft Senator Feldman, Chair Feldman, to run for governor. And I'm going to just use that as my example today. So there's going to be an effort, there's a draft committee, and the folks who are organizing that start raising millions of dollars because everyone thinks that Senator Feldman would be a great governor. There is absolutely no transparency. There's no accountability. See, he's liking this. There's no accountability. And there are so many problems with that. So first off, let's say Feldman runs, let's say Feldman is elected, and someone who gives him $1 million, which is legal, for his draft committee or exploratory committee, then puts in for a contract, gets a $10 million contract for their company, and no one would be the wiser. There would be no accountability, no sunshine, and that is not the way we do things in Maryland. This is not hypothetical. a lot of Democrats and Republicans have run either exploratory or draft committees. And just briefly, Michael Steele for governor, Laura Newman for governor, Jim Shea for governor, many others. Larry Hogan in 2010 actually had an exploratory or there's a draft. There is no contribution limit, and that will stay unchanged. So an exploratory or draft committee could still take lots and lots of money, and that will be fine. It would just have to be disclosed in the same way that we all disclosed our campaign finance. So there are three possible outcomes when you have an exploratory or draft committee. One, the candidate decides to run. Two, the candidate decides not to run and makes that announcement. Or three, the filing deadline passes. So in any of those three situations, the exploratory or the draft committee is no longer needed. So it needs to be dissolved. We were deciding what seems reasonable, and the House sponsor and I decided that 120 days in consultation with the State Board of Elections. 90 days we thought was a little too brief. A year was way too long. So 120 days, pay all the bills, wrap things up, file a report, close down the account. The other thing that this bill does is say what you can spend money on, because that's important. So you get all these millions of dollars, what are you going to do with them? So we specifically have in the bill, and I'll tell you about amendment. So it says that you can conduct a survey or a poll. That makes sense. Feldman wants to decide, wants to figure out whether he's going to have the support if he wants to run for governor. You can do direct mail. And that's part of how you're going to change your poll numbers and get them up. So you can do mailers. That makes sense. You can hire staff. That makes sense because you need people to do all this. You can set up a website. With their amendment, we also add that you can rent or lease office space. And you have the amendment. It's attached to my testimony in your online, but for those watching at home, you can also buy equipment. You can buy electronic equipment, including computers and telephones. So basically, you can do the stuff that is required of setting up a campaign. You can't, though, buy television time for 3 months from now. You can't start doing stuff that is unrelated to exploring or drafting a candidate. So when you're wrapping up this committee, 120 days after either the candidate says, I'm running, I'm not running, or the deadline has passed, what happens to any leftover money? And that was important to indicate. And there are options. One is you return it to the donors on a pro rata basis. So someone who gave $100 and you spent 50% of the money in the account, you could send them back $50. And that would be one option. Another option is you can give it to their political party, either the state party or a local party. Third, you can donate it to the Fair Campaign Fund, which is how we subsidize our gubernatorial campaigns and have money available for that. And lastly, you can give it to a nonprofit organization, a 501c3. And that is basically what this bill does. It really is closing a loophole so that we have more transparency in these committees that do exist. And I think with that, I am ready to take questions. The fiscal note is essentially zero, and I think this is just a common sense bill. So thank you for your attention. Happy to take any questions.
Well, I mean, this is quite a loophole. I'm surprised we haven't, has there been bills along these lines before?
To my knowledge, there has not.
So just so I'm clear, like right now, as we sit under current law, an exploratory committee can get set up for governor. There is no prohibition, and I know Jared's here, that would allow the exploratory committee to do what you said the bill specifically says you cannot do, pay an advance rent for 6 months, you dissolve, and I mean, we have nothing on the books that, same thing with, okay, that's.
There are no guardrails at all. There's no transparency and no limitations. And I'm just going to say again.
And no caps on contributions.
No caps on contributions, which this bill will not change. And that's about First Amendment. It is seen, the Supreme Court has said that money is speech and free speech. So somebody could still donate $1 million if they wanted. Now, if the candidate decides to run, let me just address a couple of quick things. So Feldman says, yes, I'm going to run for governor after having the draft committee or the exploratory committee. couple of things. You give back a bunch of the money. You can give the maximum amount to the candidate. So the exploratory or draft committee could give the 6,000 or 10,000 or whatever the number would be, could do that, but couldn't transfer over the multiple millions that they might have raised. The other thing is that the campaign committee, the campaign organization, if there is one, if the candidate decides to run, could buy the website, could buy the computer equipment, the telephones, the stuff that's been purchased for fair market value. And we put that in specifically. So you can't buy it for $1. You have to buy it for fair market value. So you can't get a sweetheart deal. But there should be that kind of accountability. It also has to be fair. There has to be some continuity if there's an exploratory or a draft committee. So again, this is transparency and some guardrails on specificity, what to spend the money on and how to close it out.
And just one kind of related, because again, I'm surprised we have not dealt with this before, but if I go to the State Board of Elections website, I mean, do the exploratory committees subject to the same kind of reporting requirements that we put on our campaign committees? I mean, what is required of an exploratory committee in terms of filing in the State
Jared, do you
Board of
wanna come up?
Elections, Jared?
Just so you get it from the horse's mouth here. Not that he's a horse. Sorry.
He's not an ace.
Sorry that the people at home didn't get to hear that because it was funny.
Jared Demarinis, Director of Candidacy and Campaign Finance for the State Board of Elections. So currently, we've been going off of guidance from past, I would say, AG opinion, and we published it in the summary guide on exploratory committees and their activities. We recently put it into regs, which is why I think this kind of spurred this legislation. Thank you, Senator, for doing that. And but right now there is no reporting requirements for them for that activity, because there is nothing.
And just one, and then I'll yield to some other, but just I'm again a little perplexed even by the First Amendment issue. So why would the First Amendment kick in so strongly about no caps here when we do have campaign contribution limits, obviously, on all our campaigns? I'm educated. I mean, I'm a lawyer, but this is outside my scope. Why would the First Amendment be a problem in terms of any kind of limitation on what can be donated to an exploratory committee?
So I guess at one point here, I mean, it's a matter for debate, as every legal issue is. It's the governmental interest. I am not a candidate for seeking public office. I'm thinking about it. So at that point there, I have a little bit more protections, and the quid pro quo aspect of contribution limits is supposed to comes into play for candidates and for elected officials. So this is even before that. It's kind of like, I'm just thinking about this process here.
Okay, well, let me press you. What if I'm a current office holder and I'm only exploring running for another office?
So you cannot currently, as a current office holder, do any exploratory activities, because see, in the state of Maryland, your campaign account is attached to you as a candidate, not for the office that you seek. So while you see this more on the federal side, where you have like, oh, I'm thinking about running for president and I'm a congressman or a senator, and they form those exploratory committees, those offices are attached to the actual office that they're seeking rather than the individual. So here, which is why you can run for any office in the state, from the county all the way through the state. It's the same pot of money. So we just basically say you're a candidate for an elected public office. So this law and the regs have always said that exploratory activities is prohibited for anybody who has ever filed a authorized candidate committee.
Because this
So
area's
if
got
I
a
can-
little,
could I-
yeah.
If I didn't just clarify
Sure.
what Jared just said. So yes, and so first off, just to be clear, an exploratory or a draft committee is probably done by other people. You can't have a draft Feldman committee that you're running, right? So it's done in another bank account by another person, all this stuff. And the amendment and stuff we clarified, because if you're thinking about governor and then you say, no, I'm just going to run for the Senate again. The bill as it originally drafted, that was unclear that was an option. So we wanted to make sure if it's another option. Sufficient, sorry.
Okay, do we have some questions from the panel? We've got Senator Watson.
Thank you so much. Good to finally meet you, Chair.
Yep.
So now I'm totally confused. So, but if you can tell me how slates map into all this, could somebody theoretically have an exploratory committee, put money into that, and then the exploratory committee transfer the funds to a slate? I'm just trying to understand how all that mixes together.
Do you want me to go or you go? You go. Go
Okay.
ahead.
So exploratory committees is for non-candidates. So everyone here is a candidate, whether you're, on the ballot or not. And that applies to the 2,000 probably other candidate committees that we have there. As soon as you open up a candidate committee, you're a candidate for a public office, which is why you can only raise and spend your money in seeking or promotion of your candidacy. You join a slate, which is comprised of other candidates. Individuals that never open up that first step of filing that statement of organization, but are thinking about running for public office, this is for them. So you've never opened it up. You've never officially made any sort of announcement or concrete steps towards running. I'm thinking about it. I'm going to do a poll just to see what's going on out there. You can't join a slate because in order to join a slate, you have to be a candidate, and you have to have so basically it's for a very small sliver of would say like Governor Hogan before he ran, right? He was a private citizen, didn't have a candidate committee. He could do an exploratory committee, but like Ron George, who ran against him in the election in 2014, he couldn't because he was already a member of the state Senate and he was already in the regulated community. So House. Sorry.
I just want to clarify though, what Jared said is nearly right, but not quite right with the amendment. So I just want to, sorry,
it's like my law school.
I just want to flag for you again, the amendment at the bottom of page 1 of the amendment. It clarifies, and if you look at the bill, the individual the draft committee intends to encourage to seek public office is not a candidate, is what the bill says, but it's for that public office. So and then it's substitute, or for another office. So you can be a current office holder exploring a race for a different office and not have to shut down or never having run for office before. That was a drafting change that I asked for in the amendment.
At the moment, an individual decides to become a candidate.
Yes.
That exploratory committee can only provide the max of 6,000 to that person's individual campaign committee.
Correct.
Could the exploratory committee put anything into the slate account now that this individual is now part of?
No, because then the slate,
it's
$6,000 to a candidate. So right now, if I give $6,000, say to you, right, to your candidate committee, I'm prohibited from giving to the slate because the slate then has to attribute my contribution of $6,000 to all the candidates equally. And thus you're a member of the slate, and whatever sliver I would go over, it would make my contribution to you over the $6,000 limit, because it's a person may not give more than $6,000 to a candidate, regardless of whatever committees that the candidate is affiliated with.
So now aren't you getting kind of in some kind of dollar cost averaging here with the members of a slate? Some have made more in their personal accounts, some have made less. And so how can you take input from to a slate account and attribute it all to me when the other members of the slate have raised nothing?
No, but it's equally divided. So if it's $1,000, right, and there's 4, I'm still going to attribute $250 to you for purposes of contribution limits. Now, we can talk more about that offline, but there's ways, and then slate members to slates, there's all different limits at that point there.
Okay.
But this would be contributed almost like as an individual or a person outside.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to Senator Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, I just want to also, just for clarification.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's one of these committees, exploratory committee. And right now, someone could take that exploratory committee and spend money on somebody who's exploring and all the way up like to the filing deadline, as it were. And could they just spend, I mean, is this currently the case? Like they could just do whatever? I mean, as far as like raising money and spending money on behalf of the individual, is that the case?
Currently raise it, no limits, spend it, no limits on anything you want, trip to the Bahamas, I assume, no guardrails, no limits, and no transparency.
Okay, and these are, we do have, these are defined terms though, like
They are.
these are actually defined terms that you all have defined in regulation.
Yes, now,
And
yes.
so, and with these defined terms, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so now the follow-up to me on that is this, Senator. Given that we now know that, I'm more concerned about like the ability for the person who has this account to be able to send out mail and to be able to, in essence, run a campaign when they're not a campaign yet. How do we sort of, you understand what I'm, now that I think I'm better understanding this, that my concern would be with that?
So thank you.
And people already do this, by the way, as we
They-
well know.
they are
Like,
already
people,
doing this.
They do it.
Yeah.
You know?
So let me read just the definition, and it's on my testimony if anyone's curious, and we link to the code, the hyperlink. An exploratory committee is defined as an entity established by a prospective candidate for a public office to determine the potential candidate's viability for that public office. That's what an exploratory is. A draft committee is an entity that is organized to encourage a potential candidate to run for office, but is not authorized by the potential candidate. So draft committees are even more interesting because then, if there's a draft Feldman committee, to continue with my example, Feldman may have zero control over what they spend money, who they hire, where they lease the office space, what the mailers say. It could almost be an independent expenditure because it's not his committee. He's not in charge. Kind of crazy.
Okay, I mean, this.
So
I'm-
it is a problem
Yeah.
and we need to close the
I
loopholes
mean,
and we
I'm
need to have
just
transparency.
thinking of the hypotheticals with that $30 million no cap contribution to the Feldman Exploratory Committee and what, I mean, it's like, I just can't believe this is the current law.
Yep.
Okay. That said, any additional witnesses for Mr. Marinus or the sponsor?
The last thing I just want to mention is the Attorney General endorsed this bill. You have the Attorney General's testimony, and Common Cause suggested an amendment, which I'm fine with, which is because we want to say specifically what money can be spent on, and we don't want the trip to the Bahamas. But they suggested online ads and stuff, which I think is in keeping with doing mailers, doing a poll, leasing a campaign headquarters. And so I'm fine with that if that's in the committee's meets with the committee's favor.
Okay, we do have one additional witness signed up favorable, Mr. Watkins. Bring Mr. Watkins up here and then that'll be the final witness on the bill. Mr. Watkins, you're signed up favorable.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Ralph Watkins. I'm here speaking for the League of Women Voters of Maryland. And we are strongly in favor of this bill. This is a loophole that really needs to be closed. It was Justice Brandeis who said sunlight is the best disinfectant. I had to look that up. I couldn't remember whether it was him or Holmes, but this is really important that that we not have sleight of hand committees doing what is effectively campaign work, evading the requirements for reporting, disclosing of campaign contributions and expenditures. So we urge the committee to make a favorable report on this bill. Thank you.
Okay, any additional, any questions for Mr. Watkins? We'll go Senator Lewis Young, then Senator Watson.
Should we make this emergency legislation?
I was thinking about that based on something that I think Senator Augustine was asking.
Because there may not be an election coming up, but there's no reason why you can't open up an exploratory campaign.
If that's the committee's will, it could make some sense.
I was just concerned people watching this hearing, we're going to have like an influx of exploratory draft committees tomorrow, Jared, they're gonna be like 500 people opening up
That-
Explore
That trip to the Bahamas.
2022 election, 2026 election. Okay.
Before we close, I do
yeah.
want to just, if you're about to wrap up, I just want to acknowledge and thank State Board of Elections Board Member and Board Chair, Republican Bill Velp, not only for noticing and encouraging legislative action on this, but for his leadership throughout the last challenging several years. And I'm hoping that he will continue, and that is outside of my capacity to determine, but he's done a wonderful job and has been very collaborative.
Okay, that concludes the bill hearing, excuse me, on Senate Bill 111. We're next going to move to, I apologize, Senator Watson. Yeah.
That was my question.
Okay, now we're going to move to the next bill from Senator Kagan, Senate Bill 176.
All right, we are working our way through, colleagues. You can- Election Bill number 4 out of 6 today. Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville. This bill I call fair filing. And I did not recruit a ton of witnesses. I think we might just have one. And it is really about making sure that democracy works and that voters have an opportunity to elect rather than having our colleagues or other public officials get selected. So we have had legislation and certainly will have legislation and will continue the conversation about vacancies, whether that is the Lutke vacancy that we had or Susan Lee, Senator Susan Lee, our colleague who was appointed after she was sworn in to be our Secretary of State. And then, Delegate Kelly. So after elections, after swearing in is one thing. And that is not what this is. This is before the filing deadline, before the campaign, before election day, at the very, very beginning. We've had at least 2 instances of a candidate having submitted their paperwork, filing their candidacy, and then deciding at the last second, I think I'm going to withdraw my candidacy. So in one way, it was done in a really, I don't know what adjective to use. I'll use the interesting rather than saying sleazy. In one situation, someone came in with a buddy, and I'm going to choose to withdraw my candidacy, and instead my buddy is going to file their candidacy, and I'm basically going to hand my seat to my buddy because there's not time for anyone else to file. The other one I think is well-intentioned, but had a similar but different impact, which is the person had been filed for office and last second, and when I mean last seconds, hours before the deadline, the filing deadline, ended up withdrawing their candidacy and filing for a different office. There were people who heard about it through the grapevine or on Twitter or however they heard about it and literally jumped in their car to try to get to Annapolis while calling people, will you serve as my campaign chair? Will you serve as my treasurer? Trying to hurry up, get to Annapolis before the 9 p.m. filing deadline. And literally at least one got there just after 9 p.m. So what happened was there was a vacancy. There were a lot of people who were interested, but there wasn't the opportunity because the vacant, an incumbent seeking reelection, nobody often, a lot of times people that may not decide that it's worth the effort to file against us in a primary. And so so suddenly you had a seat for which no one had filed because the incumbent had filed already. So in that case, if within 48 hours of the filing deadline, a candidate who has filed withdraws their candidacy or dies, the filing deadline would be pushed back 7 days. So you might want to think about it. You might want to have a conversation with your spouse, your employer. You want to pick a treasurer. You want to pick a campaign chair and not break speed limits records trying to get to Annapolis in time. We would have thoughtful people. They would also then be able to run a full campaign. So you might have 10 people file and have a full campaign and let the voters pick the person, rather than, as happened last year, have the vacancy considered by the Central Committee, who then picked. So rather than thousands of people voting to pick, instead, there were a couple of dozen people who picked, and there was plenty of time. I want to be clear that I cast no aspersions on the person who was selected, who I think is a wonderful, hardworking public servant. But in terms of democracy, it's not the way things should work. And I just want to show you briefly the process, the deadlines. In my testimony, I lay out, so there are some people who say, ooh, if we push back from the filing deadline, if we push it back 7 days, isn't that going to be hard on our Board of Elections, which we do need to think about all the time. So using the 2022, revised 2022, after the date had been changed and all that, based on the redistricting lawsuit and stuff. So I used these and I laid them out in my testimony. The filing deadline was April 15th at 9 p.m. So if someone pulled out within 48 hours of April 15th at 9 p.m., the deadline to file would be reopened just for that one race, just in that one district or just for that one office. And it would be proposed as April 22nd, 2022. So 1 week. Let me just say that after those dates, April 25th, you can remove a candidate name from the ballot due to the candidate's death or disqualification. That comes afterwards. The deadline for the State Board of Elections to publicize on its website the content and arrangement of each ballot, May 16th. All come far after a modest 7-day extension. So this is not big legislation, but it allows democracy to flourish in the rare cases where somebody decides to withdraw their candidacy or, God forbid, dies within 48 hours of the filing deadline. And why 48 hours? If someone had filed and then decides to withdraw 3 weeks before the election, 2 months before the election, he had plenty of time. Someone else can file. If no one files for that office, then the regular system is not changed. It would still go to the party central committees who could put a name on, and that would be fine. It's only if someone had filed, withdrew their candidacy or died. And so there was a vacant slot. And again, it's a little hard to, so if there are 20 people who had filed for House of Delegates for 3 seats and one withdrew or died, this would not kick in. It's only if the withdrawal or the death resulted in a vacant slot. It would not go to a central committee. It would go to the voters for other people to file within a 7-day extended period. I hope I was clear. It's a little complicated to explain, so I hope that works.
If I could just say, because one of the examples was in the recent election in Montgomery, one of the gentlemen who rushed down to Annapolis to try to get that that withdraw seat got there at 9:02. Yeah. And blames the fact that he didn't get to the state legislature on 2 red lights. I mean, really, it was a 2-minute situation, and I'll stop there. I mean, I will say, just commentary, this scenario back in prior elections, the idea that there's one seat there, this idea of orchestrating, showing up with your best buddy at 8:59, and the only person in the world that knows you're about to pull out that third delegate, and that scenario has happened, and that is happened. And that is very
hypothetical.
That's very, very, from an appearance, from every aspect, that really is bad. So with that said, we'll start with Senator Simon Ayer, and then we'll go to Senator Gallion.
Thank you. And I've heard of those situations as well, not just the one you're talking about. Just for clarity, you said if somebody dies, disqualifies, or withdrawals, but I think there's a number 2 in there when you have 3 delegates and there's only 2. That would expand it as well, correct?
No. So first off, not disqualify. It's just dies or withdraws. So disqualified is a different deadline, and that exists in current law, and this doesn't touch that. So if there are 3 delegate slots and only 2 people have filed, this would not apply. It's only if there are, using your example, 3 delegate seats, 3 people have filed, and 1 withdraws or dies. And then there would be 2 running and 1 vacant seat. That would be newly created, last second, tick tock. No one else had the time to come down before 9:02 PM to file.
If you could walk me through, maybe I'm looking at the wrong spot.
Yeah.
On page, bottom page 2, starting into page 3, basically says the following deadline and says, number 1, unopposed candidate dies or is disqualified or withdraws, or the number of candidates for a political party that have filed for certificate of candidacy for an office is less than the number of nominees the political party is allowed for the office.
Jared, is that the amendment that we were talking about then? I think that is the amendment because that is not the intent. If there are fewer, so I'll just use myself. I mean, so I filed for reelection. No one filed from the Republican Party to run against me. The Republican Party 4 years ago chose someone and was able to put that person's name on the ballot. Nothing about that would change. So the intent is dies or withdraws within 48 hours and only in that case. And if there's a vacancy that would then otherwise go to a central committee for an appointment, that the deadline would be extended by 7 days. So there could actually be an election if people file. If no one files and there's still only 2 names on there and an open slot, then it goes back to as it does now to the central committee. Yes, no question. Jared, that's the one.
Okay,
Thank you.
we're going to go to Senator Gallion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to be clear, this deals with everything from governor through delegate, right? This is just state
Yes, sir.
offices.
Mhm.
Okay, so let me pose a scenario that I kind of had some history with actually. Let's say, unfortunately, a Senate candidate passes away.
Yep.
That kicks in, it opens up that 48-hour window.
If they die within 48 hours of the filing deadline.
Right, so it adds that extension.
Yes.
How does that relate to normally? So you have other folks that have already filed for delegate. Are they able to withdraw from running for that delegate spot to then try to run for the Senate spot if that Senate candidate passes away?
That's a great question. Jared, do you want to speak to that? So hypothetically, let me just repeat back what I think you asked. So Senator dies or withdraws. 3 delegates, let's say incumbents or candidates, doesn't matter. 3 people have filed or 20 people have filed for delegate. One of them says, wait a minute, I want to apply. I want to run for senator instead. So they withdraw from the House, their House candidacy, file within the 7-day extended window for the Senate, but now there's a vacant slot for the House of Delegates. Jared, do you want to speak to that?
Withdraw and go
Right,
to.
could they withdraw within the 7-day window and then would that, we have not thought about that scenario.
Because
That's
we had a similar
really,
situation with my predecessor. in the
yes, of
Senate.
course, the late great
So-
Wayne Norman.
Correct.
Yes, thank you.
So yes, sorry. Jared Maris, Director of Candidacies and Campaign Finance. So the withdrawal deadline is earlier than inside the 7-day window. So if at that point there, so if this is at the end, there would be at least some point in time within the 7-day window, since it extends the filing deadline. So if the filing deadline is on the 1st, the withdrawal would be, say, on the 3rd of it, and then this would make it so that you have until the 7th. So there would be at least maybe like 2 days where there's an overlap that an individual would be able to withdraw from the office and then file for it. However, that would not trigger the delegate slot in this case to extend that. That would then go and create a withdrawal and a vacancy that would be filled by the central committee.
I think bottom line, let's talk about it.
Right.
I think you've identified a scenario that we had not considered and it's really smart. So
Yeah.
thank you. Let's have a conversation. And then we should either come up with an amendment or say, it's rare enough and you delay for the Senate and then the House is just going to go the typical way back to the Central Committee, which was what under current drafting, what would happen? And is that the best policy? So thank you for the
This
question.
is a smart committee. We're posing some good
Darn right.
questions here.
Darn
Okay,
right.
any additional questions for the sponsor or for Mr. Marinus for now? Okay, with that, we're going to move to Lisa Smith. You're signed up favorable. And then we do have one virtual unfavorable. That's all. Oh, Ms. Harper. Okay, our final witness on this will be Lisa Smith, signed up favorable.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Lisa Smith. I'm here representing on behalf of the Montgomery County Women Democrat Club. And the reason why we support this bill is that key word, democracy. She did a great job explaining it, and I'm shocked she didn't use the word shenanigans. I live, as I mentioned before, I live in District 14. On the 15th of April, I will never forget it because that was the day that I found out that I had an opponent. That was also the day that I had to deal with the death of my father. But hours later, I found out what Al Gore did, and it just really threw me.
Let's, we don't have to mention people.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to use, but I want people to know that I understood how the people in that district felt when they knew they could not put their name, or someone running could not put their name on a ballot, and they had to go through the Central Committee. And in spite of the fact that it was a holy holiday during that time period, and in spite of the fact it was tax time during that time period, we had amazing people who put their name up for appointment. And so having 7 days to give a person an opportunity to actually put their name on the ballot is reasonable. And that's why we're requesting a favorable outcome of this.
Okay, any questions for Ms. Smith? Okay, seeing none, that concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 339. I'm sorry. Yeah, we got too many Kagan bills here.
Oh, no such thing, Mr. Chair.
No. Yeah, hold on a second. That was one.
That was fair filing.
I
That was
apologize.
176.
That's 176. We're gonna.
All right, 339 is
We're next going to Senate Bill
right.
339. And Senator Kagan, Senate Bill 339. It's all yours.
Okay. Number 5 of 6, Senator Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville. This is about recount. This started out as simply updating, modernizing, and clarifying our recount laws. As you all know, we passed emergency legislation last year on recounts, when you can have them, who pays for them, and all that. You can recount in total or just parts of a district or county or state. All of that is law, was allowed to become law by Governor Hogan. So that's done. There is currently in law outdated options for recounting that we had to change. So that's the easy part of this bill. And there are just 4 options now that would be allowed under this bill. One is a rescan of the voter paper ballots involved in the recount using precinct tabulators or a high-speed scanner if one is available to reproduce the early voting precinct, mail-in, or provisional ballot canvas total. That's option 1. Option 2 is a manual recount of the voted paper ballots involved in the recount. 3 is a manual tabulation of printed reports. This is really a silly one, but it is allowed and we're going to keep it, which is just sort of count the subtotals and just total them up again and make sure that that's accurate. And then the 4th one is any other recount that the SBE, the State Board of Elections Administrator, has approved. So those are the 4 options. And again, no change. A candidate can ask for a full recount or a partial recount based on concerns, areas, or budgets. Here's the only part that that is a little complicated. And again, I'm gonna have to lay out internet voting, internet delivered ballots, because voters believe that they bank online, they shop online, they date online. So why shouldn't they be able to vote online? So they said, yeah, just send me my ballot through the internet. And what they think they're going to get is their ballot, and that they'll go click, 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 and push return, push send, and that's it. It couldn't be further from the truth. It is hard at the voter end, and it is hard at the receiving end for our local boards of elections. So I do have to describe what this process is, and I plead that you and anyone watching help reduce the number of internet delivered ballots because of their complexity and because of the possibility of error. And let me just walk through this. So Susie voter says, yes, I want an internet delivered ballot. She is sent a link. She clicks on it. First off, Susie has to have a printer at home. A lot of young people don't even have printers anymore. Second, the printer has to have toner cartridge, which means that Susie can afford to pay for toner cartridge. And it might be pages and pages and pages if we're talking about ballot measures and long number of people running for various office. So Susie prints all that out, and it's on paper, just paper, right? She casts her ballot, and then she has to have an envelope because it has to be put in an envelope. Then she's got to hand address to her Board of Elections, and she's got to pay for postage because this is not a postage paid envelope, or drop it off at her local drop-off box, or deliver it to the Board of Elections. So all of that is hard for Susie the voter, but the process is just beginning. When her ballot is delivered by mail or through a drop-off box to the Board of Elections, they then, and we've already talked about how it's harder to log in, it's harder to scan, but this piece of paper, 20 pieces of paper, 10 pieces of paper, cannot go through our ballot scanners. So they have to recruit, every local boards of election has to recruit and pay for bipartisan teams. So a Republican and Democrat, or a Republican and independent, or Democrat and independent, they sit there and they have to take a ballot that can go through the scanner and take your piece of paper, pieces of paper, and say, okay, for Governor Smith, for Attorney General Jones, and go through, and then they switch them out and they check each other's work to make sure they're accurate. Nobody's playing any games here, to use Liza's word, no shenanigans, and that it's accurate. It's only after all of that has been done in two-person teams, transparently, with anyone being able to watch, and hopefully not having any errors, that then this piece of paper is transferred to a scannable ballot, which is a different thickness, different size, different consistency, thickness. So that can then be scanned and counted, tabulated, right? That is all hard. In the case of a recount, and the part of this that's relevant for this bill is that because that process is the most likely place where there could be human error, not fraud, not games, but error, just because humans are human and sometimes they make errors. And I can say in our county executive race, where David Blair picked up a few votes, it was one vote in this batch and one vote 200 batches later. I mean, it was literally one or two ballots that were just mistransposed. So what this bill dictates is that the original piece of paper that you printed out at home and the ballot that was scanned be batched together in case there's a recount. So it sounds complicated, the whole process of it, but it's the last piece, and it's really important in case of a close election. So if all the pieces of paper, well, we've already transposed them, so we can recycle them, we can toss them, we have no reason for them anymore, or we'll just throw them in a big pile or a big box, or mush the ballots that have been scanned in with all the other ballots that have been scanned. All of those are possible. This just requires a little more discipline. So whether it's batches of 25 or 50 or whatever number, the original piece of paper printed out at home and the ballot that was actually scanned that is supposed to be identical to these pieces of paper, they just need to be binder clipped, foldered, boxed, whatever, together. So in case of a recount, that you can find out whether there was an error, and you would only recount, and this bill says this, you would recount the paper. So if there was an error in the transposing and the duplication of ballots from paper to a ballot, a scannable ballot, that would be identified because we'd be only counting from the original printed at home piece of paper. I hope that's clear. Again, some of this stuff I know is like so in the weeds, but it's really important to make sure that our election and our democracy goes smoothly.
Okay, we've
So,
got
yeah.
Senator Gallian's right. Got a question, right? Did I apologize? Did I? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to say this is not a hypothetical issue. We've had a member of the House of Delegates elected by 12 votes. We had in Baltimore County, the 17 vote margin. I've already referenced 2 very close elections in Montgomery County for county executive. Close votes happen, close elections happen. And so we just want to make sure that it can be counted 100% accurately in cases of a recount. And I'm happy to take questions, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Senator Gallion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kind of heard 2 different bills now talking about these printed out
Yeah.
pieces of paper.
Yeah.
So this would kind of be a question for this one, but my understanding is this is basically kind of creating a paper trail to help us when we have a recount. We know, like you said, that this is all on the up and up. My question is kind of combines this bill with one of your other bills. It looks like these printed paper ballots are just a lot of work and create a lot of problems. We're already allowing, mail in for any reason, and we're paying for the postage. Why not just eliminate this whole printed thing? It seems like it's a lot more trouble than it's worth.
Great question. And hypothetically, great idea. But you just, God forbid, grandma died. You had to get on a plane. You were going to vote tomorrow. You can't. So an internet delivered ballot is the only way you can cast a ballot. Or you're away in college, you're studying or working out of state, you're on a business trip, whatever it is, or you're in the hospital yourself. There are some circumstances where people need to be able to get last second access to a ballot, and an internet delivered ballot is really the only viable option. So we don't want to remove that as a voting option because there are some rare times, but there are a bunch of us who have been working and thinking about ways of diminishing, of shrinking the numbers. Because as David Naiman says, as everybody, all the election administrators and election leaders know, they are really, really challenging. And they're not just challenging for our election workers, but for the voters. It's hard for the voters, and they don't realize that. And I'll say one more thing and then I'll stop. There was a 50% increase in provisional ballots last year. And I think in large part, it's from people who said, yes, internet delivered ballot sounds good. And then they got it and they said, holy cripes, I'm not able to do this. And they showed up at the polls, early voting or on election day, and they voted provisionally. And I think that's why, because this is hard and they didn't understand that. So we need an education effort to make sure that folks don't choose this option because they think it's easy and then they learn that it's hard.
Back to that point, with the mail-ins, and then now you're going to get them automatically once you first request. I would, if people think they're going to be at the last minute and have this issue, which we're hoping is rare, I would prefer them to try to get them to do the mail-ins and make. And I just don't think the juice is worth the squeeze at all on this for the amount of work that's going to people. It delayed a lot of things in a couple of really close Senate. I know at least one state Senate race that. We're talking about trying to let people count ballots earlier so we don't have these delays, but this leads to a huge delay. So I would hope that we can continue to have a conversation on how to make this rare thing. I just want to make sure the juice is worth a squeeze. So thank you.
Totally agree. And one of the conversations that I've been on over the last year or two has been about how do we educate voters? Don't pick this one unless you have to. I don't think we want to do it legislatively. Do we do it through regs? Do we send a follow-up letter? Here's what it's going to take if you really, really, really want to vote this way. Are you sure? Because here's what you're going to have to do. We haven't figured it out, or I haven't heard of someone who has figured it out yet, but we do need a solution because it's a problem. So thank you, Senator Gallion.
Okay, any additional questions for the sponsor? Okay, seeing none, we do have Mr. Naiman. Mr. Naiman, why don't you come up here and favorable with amendment?
Thank you. My name is David Naiman. I'm the Secretary and Democratic Leader of the Montgomery County Board of Elections here just on my own behalf. I want to say first that last year's recount legislation was a major achievement and we thank you. I've had a fair amount of experience now with recounts in Montgomery County. We had, as Senator Kagan mentioned, a House of Delegates recount in 2018. We've had county executive recounts in both 2018 and 2022. I personally would welcome any additional clarifications on the recount rules. I didn't hear anything that Senator Kagan says in terms of her intent that would bother me. I am concerned about some of the language in the bill because the bill has some language that suggests that you must look at only the original ballot and not at the duplicate, and that phraseology can lead to some situations that may not be what you all would intend. The example that I'm thinking of, first of all, Senator Kagan mentioned the Blair Elrich race. In Mr. Blair's case, he gained a number of votes in that recount. Most of them were not. There may have been one or two duplication errors. In 2018, there were 0. But most of those, the votes that he gained were votes that the machine counts as overvotes. And that when we do a hand count, they get brought to the Board of Elections to determine voter intent. And usually that's someone who X's out one choice, circles the other choice. And we might determine that the person who circled is who the voter actually wanted to support, but the machine doesn't do that. The machine says you voted twice, therefore it's kicked out. So you can pick up votes in that fashion. My concern is that if you are required by law to only count the original ballot, you are counting the ballot with the overvote. I completely agree. We already batch the duplicates and the originals together. We already go back and look at every intent decision we make. The first time we go back and look at them a second time. But I wouldn't want you to pass legislation that says that it has to be an exact facsimile, and it says that we are required to count only the voter verifiable paper record, not the duplicate ballot, in a manual recount under this subtitle. In that situation, if the board has made an intent determination, I would just want to make sure that it's clear in the statute that you're going with that intent determination, not that you're going with the original ballot if it had problems. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Naiman, any questions for Mr. Naiman? And yeah, take some more time because again, you're the only witness.
I
left, so,
appreciate that.
yeah.
I did want to say something about Senator Gallen's point about the web delivered ballots. To me, while I'm a big believer that everyone should be informed exactly what is entailed, both on their end and on our end. And if I could come up with a system where in order to request the ballot, you had to check off boxes that said that you knew that A, B, C, and D are true and that E and F are true when it gets to us, that would be my solution. The reason why I'm personally uncomfortable with eliminating mail-in ballots is that, first of all, they're required by federal law for military and overseas voters. And I personally have a problem with having methods of voting for some voters and not others. But the second, even bigger problem is that a number of our voters are coming to vote provisionally or are asking for second ballots because it's taking a long time for them to get their first ballot. And as long as it's, if it's taking 2 weeks for someone to get the ballot that they ask for by US mail, I have a problem with telling them that they can't get a web delivered ballot that they can get in a matter of a day or two. Because to me, the goal is to make sure that they have one usable ballot. So if we can come up with a solution for that, so that the ballots by US mail show up in a more timely fashion, I might have a different, a different view. But that to me is the reason about that. Everything that Senator Kagan said about how difficult those ballots are is true. I just don't know that I would eliminate them for that reason. There are obviously also challenges with some other methods of voting as well.
Okay, any additional questions? Yes, Senator Kagan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just wanted to let colleagues know that I have 2 additional bills that are not being heard today, and one of them does deal, and I had spoken to Mr. Naiman and others about stray marks, and so that is addressed. There are a couple of other things that have been referenced today that are in the bill that's being heard next week.
Okay. Okay, well, that said, that concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 339, which brings us to our final bill of the day. Senator Kagan, Senate Bill 863.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, the last bill, maybe save the best for last. Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville. This bill, I want to thank Senator Simonaire for making it very clear that this is a bipartisan bill. And this bill is simply brackets. What does that mean? It literally just removes language that was passed and added to our law books in 2005 that doesn't really hold up today. And it is related to the administrator of our State Board of Elections, who is unique in her status, in his status, in that person's status as kind of untouchable. And it's supremely hard to remove that incumbent person. So to be clear, in 2005, it indicated, the law was enacted and added to our statutes, that there is no term limit. There's no term currently. They can be removed for incompetence, misconduct, or other good cause by a supermajority of the SBE board. It must be done in writing, and the process is strikingly onerous. Specifically, all 5 seats on the State Board of Elections must be filled. And we often, in the last 2 years, we had one member die, we had another one resign. We've had a lot of vacancies and there can be delays. So they all must be filled. The administrator can only be removed for specific reasons. 4 of the 5 members must vote affirmatively for removal. They must be in writing. The administrator must be given notice and, quote, ample opportunity to be heard, which sounds like an appeal. And the administrator continues to serve until a successor is chosen and confirmed by the Executive Nominations Committee and the full state Senate. So that means, according to analysts, and there has been a lot written about this, our State Board of Elections administrator could serve indefinitely, even if the State Board of Elections board has voted in favor of that person's removal. This approach lacks the fundamental accountability that we would want for an important public office. There is no one else in state government that has this kind of protection. Other states have much different process, and I think we can do it better. I will just say that it has often been observed that, quote, no other employee of our state government enjoys this level of statutory job protection. And so literally, if you look at the bill, colleagues, this is, the bill is here. There's a bracket on page 1, line 20, an open bracket. There is a closed bracket on page 2, line 3. It simply removes language that was added in 2005. I will mention in closing that Delegate Dana Jones, my House Crossfile partner, and I have discussed, and I'd love to hear from any of you, whether there's wisdom to having a term, not term limits, but a term in office, and whether that would make sense. And I am open to hearing your thoughts about that. But the bottom line is we must make our State Board of Elections administrator more accountable and easier to remove for good reasons if a supermajority, a bipartisan supermajority, believes that there should be a change. And it shouldn't have to be jumping through so many hoops. So happy to take questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, on this Kagan-Simonaire bill, we're going to go to Senator Augustine.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. So would you agree that there should be a pretty high bar, just given how we wouldn't want this position to become like politicized, and that wouldn't that have probably been some of like the idea or the thought process for creating this, because we wouldn't want it to be something that could potentially be politicized?
Thank you for the question, Senator Augustine. There's a 5-member Board of Elections. The majority party holds 3 seats. The minority party holds 2. A majority to do anything, a simple majority, would be 3 votes. This would be 4 votes, which by definition would require a supermajority. And I agree with you, there should be a high bar. We don't want to randomly start removing people, especially in important positions. But if someone else isn't doing their job, or isn't being responsive, or isn't being ethical, or isn't being isn't yielding the outcome that the General Assembly or the governor or whomever expects for that position, they should be able to be removed without going through hoops and processes and hearings and all that. So yes, I agree. It should not be willy-nilly, but it should be possible to accomplish.
Understanding that, but wouldn't what you just said, if the folks agreed with it, wouldn't that fall under incompetence? I mean, wouldn't that be the case? Versus now, if this isn't here, a person could be removed because folks disagree with them politically?
If they disagreed politically, it would be hard to imagine that you could get a super majority.
Oh, I could definitely see how it could happen. Like, folks change their party. I mean, this is bipartisan right now. You know, we got these folks here. I could surely see where that could occur, particularly given we don't know, and I don't know the answer to this, the people who are members of the board, what is the process for them getting there and them being removed, since where they might be able to be in such a situation.
Yep. To speak to that, how are board members selected? The political parties pick. So they're not going to pick someone who's going to be not really a Democrat or not really a Republican and just a placeholder. They're going to pick a true blue and a true red, and people who are going to hopefully collaborate, as this past Board of Elections has done.
Okay,
through the
we're just
pandemic
gonna-
and stuff.
We're just going to probably disagree on
Okay.
that. I've observed where folks who we thought
Yes.
were going to do one thing,
Yes.
once they get to
Yes.
there, they do something very different.
Yes.
I've observed that quite a bit. Thank
So
you.
I will just speak to the one last thing. It has been evaluated and written about that hypothetically, and I am not casting aspersions, but hypothetically, our SBE administrator could commit a felony, could be in jail for life, and not be able to be removed as SBE administrator under the current law. There has been a lot written. I'm happy to share it with you, but it's a problem. We need to be able to have better accountability in this very important public position.
Okay, and before we go to Senator Crosa, I just want to acknowledge Senator Washington coming back, because she took one for the team today. We did have these bills, and everybody should really thank, she represented the committee on several jointly assigned bills, and will, I'm sure, impart her knowledge on us at the appropriate time. But so she took one for the team, and you missed on some election bills, but we'll fill you in. There's some good stuff today, but thanks. Thank you. With that, we're going to go to Senator Crosa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Senator Kagan and Senator Simonaire for this bill. I truly believe that this has had a chilling effect. Common knowledge that this, and it's not about a personality, it's about the position, that this position is untouchable and it's out there. And so, you know, to have something like this with the safeguards of 4 votes, a supermajority, I believe we have a responsibility. And so I want to thank you.
Thank you, Senator Crosa.
Any additional questions for the sponsor? Okay, I think that does it, and that concludes the bill hearing on 863. And that
Before we
absolutely.
adjourn from
Yes.
6 Kagan election bills, I want to thank you all for your interest and your really great questions. I also just have to give a super special shout out to my staff who rose to the occasion when we had a bit of a crisis in preparing for today. And so Brennan Mirage and Garrett Beloff, who are behind me, have just done heroic work over the last few days, and I just want to publicly thank them. And Susan Burkett, my legacy fellow, and yes, thank you.
Okay, so folks, that'll conclude the bill hearings for today, but we're going to take how much? Okay, we need to sort of do a little reboot. So take 10 minutes, come back. We're going to jam out some bills out of this committee, send them to the floor, hopefully. And so see you back here in 10.